Good morning. Welcome back to the Ag Committee. This morning, we're going to jump right in and start on right to repair farm equipment. But before we get started, I want to welcome Representative Stiff. We're in his hometown, and thanks for being here, Clark. And with that, I'll turn it over to LSO and we'll talk about right to repair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, we have a right to repair memo in your packet. This memo outlines the right to repair farm equipment issue. It's been reported that farmers and ranchers have increasingly encountered barriers to repairing their equipment. For relatively new equipment, farmers must take their equipment to an authorized dealer for service rather than doing it themselves or taking the equipment to a shop of their choice. The use of proprietary software means that only authorized manufacturers know how to repair these components, and many farmers wait weeks for service, causing delay in harvesting and other work. On the other hand, farm equipment manufacturers seek to protect their proprietary interests, worrying that if farmers are given source code, they could override safety features and there could be a minimalization of value and intellectual property. On January 1st, 2024, Colorado became the first state to enact right to repair agricultural equipment legislation. The new law allows farmers to repair their own equipment or have an independent mechanic do it. And agricultural equipment manufacturers now need to provide necessary parts, software, firmware, tools, or documentation to independent repair providers and owners at a fair and reasonable price. Trade secrets are allowed to be redacted, and the new law also allows memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, that an agricultural equipment manufacturer enters into to govern an owner's right to provide services, unless the MOU would deny an owner any right under the new law. Montana, South Dakota, and Utah all proposed right to repair legislation recently, but none of it was enacted. The legislation doesn't substantially differ from what was enacted in Colorado. And it's also important to note that the American Farm Bureau Federation recently worked with approximately 3/4 of agricultural machinery manufacturers to develop MOUs regarding right to repair farm equipment. And these MOUs give farmers access to error codes, specialty tools, and information on how to fix problems while protecting companies' intellectual property rights. It should be noted that MOUs are not binding, and it's unclear right now how helpful they'll end up being. And then right to repair legislation was introduced in Wyoming in 2017 and 2018. The legislation doesn't substantially differ from that of Colorado, Montana, South Dakota, and Utah, and neither bill was enacted at that time. And I would stand for any questions.
Does the committee have any questions for Anna? I have one question. What's the difference between the 2017 and 2018 proposed legislation?
From what I could tell, Mr. Chairman, by reviewing it, there's one extra definition in the 2018 iteration. Then I think in 2017, there's a penalty, a civil penalty in there, but there really isn't too much of a difference between the two.
Thank you. Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anna, did you do any research on the reasons why that legislation didn't pass in those other states? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I didn't run across why it didn't go through. That's a little unclear at this time. I have a feeling the players in the room might be able to answer that question.
Any more questions for Anna? All right. If not, we're going to move on to the Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. I believe Mr. Moline is online. Please introduce yourself, and even though we all know you.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, thank you. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federations, giving greetings from downtown Lucerne, Wyoming. My family and my wife and I have just moved up here as we speak. A little background on the right to repair. When we tried this before, we were extremely frustrated. Farmers and ranchers couldn't get codes. We ran some legislation. We were told by the manufacturers those codes will be available in the future. It didn't really happen. So American Farm Bureau Federation has worked diligently getting MOUs, memorandums of understanding with several manufacturers, that those codes will be available to them and to independent business owners, smaller repair shops that are not affiliated with the manufacturer. We feel good about where we are now. What I'm hearing from my members is that we can get access. It's more of, we don't have enough dealerships. This legislation will not, any legislation with right to repair will not affect the number of dealers. This topic was broached for the last session. Some draft legislation was written. I talked with the sponsor and we agreed to make it an interim topic. But again, I don't feel that under our current situation that we really need to do any legislation. American Farm Bureau has a site that I can distribute out if it's wanted, that if there is complaints about not getting codes, that they will work on it. Again, we feel good about where we are. This was served more to be an informational session. Do we need to do anything? Do we need any legislation? And from my standpoint, no, we do not. One of the things that I would add about the Colorado legislation, if I understand that situation correctly, it went much farther beyond farm equipment, farm and agricultural equipment. It also dealt with computers, electronic. So it was much broader than just right to repair agricultural production equipment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would take any questions you or the committee may have.
Any questions, committee? Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Moline, just a quick question. What are the applicable years? When did this really start manifesting itself? Is it tractors after X year or before? Can you educate me, please?
Mr. Moline.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I can't give you an exact date, but it was one of those things that, I mean, much like automobiles, it was kind of creep. Okay, we'll put, electronic ignition in. Then we started doing other things. So it's probably been in the last 15 years that it manifested as a problem. And the equipment dealers did not want to give their codes out because it was proprietary information. But now that they are giving it out, I feel the situation has kind of resolved itself.
Any more questions from the committee? Representative Banks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Moline, we heard, thank you for working on this. I know we had lots of discussions about this before the prior session. So we heard from our good LSO people that the MOUs aren't exactly binding. But do you feel that it's binding enough that when we change people, that the relationships that have been built go away and there's new people in these positions trying to work through this, that MOU is binding enough that it will allow what needs to be done on the manufacturer side as well as the farmers and mechanics sides perpetually?
Mr. Moline.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Banks, yes, I feel good about where we're at. Change in personnel is always an issue, but we've had these MOUs for several years and they keep working. So I feel good about where we're at. I feel they are binding. I think if the companies reneged on it, I think there would be quite a firestorm. And so I think, they understand that it's not a good idea to do it. So I feel good about where we're at.
Any follow-up? Any additional questions for Mr. Moline? All right, Mr. Moline, thanks for being with us today and hope you enjoy the move-in and unpacking boxes. We will see you at the next meeting.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
I
just
think
one
we'll
thing I'd
move
like
on.
to add. I think everybody should move every 10 years, or at least act like you're gonna move. 20 years is too dang long. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to zoom in. Thank you.
That might be some of the best advice you've given us.
Mr. Chairman, let me clarify. That is not my member's position. That was a personal statement.
Thank you, Mr. Moline. All right, we're going to have Rocky Mountain Farmers Union come up, please. If you fine gentlemen would introduce yourselves to the committee, please.
Mr. Chairman, Scott Zimmerman with Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. It's good to be in front of you guys again. It's been a long time. I've got almost 40 years experience as a lobbyist. I'm fighting an ongoing situation with Parkinson's, so I'm not out in public and doing the job I used to do, I hope. But this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. There is a lot of cases where there's still issues between farmers or ranchers and equipment manufacturers and dealers in getting the necessary software and scanning items to the producer in a timely manner. And as we all know, being in agriculture, timely is everything. If you're in the middle of harvest season and you need to get a combine back in the field and it's not running right, and you're down 3 days waiting for a scan, it's not going to work. So that's primarily why we're supporting drafting legislation for this issue. And with that, I'll turn it over to my partner, Tyler Garrett from our office in Denver.
Thank you, Mr.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the Agriculture, State, Public Lands, and Water Resources Committee. My name is Tyler Garrett. I am the Director of Government Relations for Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, and we are a general farm organization that represents family farmers and ranchers through our grassroots policy process in Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. At its essence, right to repair fundamentally deals with two things: competition and freedom of choice. We have seen increased consolidation amongst equipment manufacturers and their respective dealers. This includes here in Wyoming, where just recently, two of the largest equipment manufacturer dealers in the region have consolidated. With the merger of 21st Century and Four Rivers, the farmers and ranchers in Southeast Wyoming and the surrounding region have been left with little to no other option for an equipment dealer. Further consolidation leads to continual decrease in competition, which ultimately leads to higher prices for consumers. In this case, the consumers in this situation are the family farmers and ranchers that we represent and that you represent. As tractors and other farming equipment become more and more technologically advanced to make the jobs of farmers and ranchers a little easier, one major aspect of this advancement has made the lives of many farmers and ranchers quite a bit more difficult, repairing their equipment when it breaks in a timely manner. Due to the hardship, the undue hardship and mental strain this has on farmers and ranchers, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union supports right to repair legislation. Right to repair legislation, simply put, would give farmers and ranchers the freedom to either repair their own equipment or to take their equipment to a mechanic of their choice to be repaired, which includes the authorized equipment dealers or independent repair providers. Rocky Mountain Farmers Union was intimately involved in the legislation last year that made Colorado the first state in the nation to provide farmers and ranchers with the right to repair their own agricultural equipment. The crux of this law is in this paragraph, and it's very similar to what was done in previous legislation here in Wyoming. And it's, quote, "For the purpose of providing services for equipment in the state, an original equipment manufacturer shall, with fair and reasonable terms and costs, make available to an independent repair provider or owner of the manufacturer's equipment any documentation, parts, embedded software for agricultural equipment, firmware, tools, or with the owner authorization data that are intended for use with the equipment or any other part, including updates to documents, parts, embedded software for agricultural equipment, firmware, tools, or with owner authorization data." Ultimately, original equipment manufacturers and equipment dealers that do not comply with the law by providing farmers and ranchers or independent repair providers with the tools necessary required under the law can be found in violation of an unfair or deceptive trade practice. I do want to clarify that while Colorado has worked on right to repair for other technologies, such as wheelchairs and things along those lines, the bill that was passed in 2023 was specifically right to repair for agricultural equipment. I will try to be a little briefer and wrap up by saying these few things. This process is not going to be easy. There will be a lot of misinformation, as there has been in other states. There will be confusion about what right to repair really is, and we must be willing to compromise on, but not on what is important. And at the end of the day, we need to listen to our family farmers and ranchers. I hope that you will consider bringing forward agricultural right to repair legislation to provide the family farmers and ranchers in Wyoming the ability to choose how they fix their equipment, either fixing it themselves, bringing it to an independent repair provider, or bringing it to the manufacturer's authorized repair provider. This is common sense legislation that provides agricultural producers the ability to get their equipment fixed in a timely manner so they can continue to provide the food, fiber, and fuel to the people of Wyoming, the United States, and abroad. Thank you for your time and for listening to me speak about this important issue for the family farmers and ranchers that we represent. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We got all sorts of questions. Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Tyler, since Colorado passed that legislation last year, what has been the effect of that? Has it drastically changed things for the farmers and ranchers? Has it improved their ability to repair their equipment, push back from machinery dealers? Can you expand a little more on things? Thank you, sir.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator French. So the bill went into effect on January 1 of this year, and so we have not had many complaints yet. We've had, as we are going through the season, we're going to be closely watching what happens and see if anyone has issues, but we've not had anyone complain yet that they've not been able to get the information that they need from the equipment dealers. But that's something that's still ongoing that we're monitoring since it just started about 6 months ago.
Follow up. Representative Banks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So we just heard testimony that there's some MOUs in place. So are you hearing from your members that those MOUs don't go far enough, or that they're not made so that the manufacturers have to do it in a timely fashion? They just kind of get around to it when they do. Would you just clarify that for me?
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Banks. So with the MOUs, from our members and as well as members from across the area, Farmers Union in total represents, the National Farmers Union represents around 34 states, and we have other states that are going through this. The MOUs do not go far enough. They do not provide independent repair providers and owners of equipment the same information that's provided to the mechanics at the dealerships. So far as to say that they can do some repairs, but when it comes to finalizing some of the repairs, and sometimes that is simply inputting a code, they can do the repair up to that point and then still have to go to the equipment manufacturer or have someone come out to their farm or ranch. The other aspect is, and that was addressed there, is that they don't feel like it is safe enough. Because the MOUs do have a clause that allow either American Farm Bureau or the equipment manufacturer to back out at any moment. They don't have to give like a lead up time. And while this wouldn't look great, it's been done before. In California, in about 10 years ago, I believe, I could be wrong on that. Some of the equipment manufacturers signed an MOU with California Farm Bureau to address these same issues. It's very similar to the national one. At that time, California was considering right to repair legislation. Within a few months of their session ending, the MOU, the equipment manufacturer backed out of the MOU. And so we're afraid that, at some point right now, they do have some access, even though it doesn't go quite far enough, that they could back out at any moment.
Follow up, Representative Banks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quick follow-up. So it's your testimony that we probably can't improve any of these MOUs good enough to make it acceptable to your members. We would need to go through legislation to make it more binding.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Banks. That is correct. We would, having the binding legislation is what will give the protection to family farmers and ranchers to ensure that they can continue to fix their own equipment in a timely manner. And that doesn't mean that they can still go back to the original dealer, but that they also now have the ability to work with an independent repair provider.
Senator French, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. With the term timely, in a timely manner may mean one thing to you, and it may mean a different thing to me. How specific is in a timely manner? I mean, that could be, you know, the dealership, the mechanic, whatever. Somebody may be busy, well, I'll get to you tomorrow or 2 days. What does that mean?
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator French. While I don't have an exact definition of timely manner, I can give you an example. One of our farmers that farms about 8,000 acres of wheat in Northeast Colorado, not far from Wyoming, his equipment went down. He's a former diesel mechanic. In that time frame, he knew what was going on, so he called his dealer and said, "Hey, this is exactly what's going on with my equipment." They said, "We'll be there in about 5 to 6 days." And this is because so many of the dealers are consolidating and that they're stretched. And that's not, you know, the mechanic's fault, but they have such a large area to cover that they just can't get there quickly. From the time his equipment broke down in the field during harvest to the time that they came after he told them that what was wrong with it, they said, "Well, we'll come and look at it." When they got there, they said, "Yes, you are right. That was what was wrong with the equipment." He said, "Did you bring the part?" And they said, "No, we couldn't do that until after we looked at the equipment. We'll go back and order it." And so they did, and it took a couple weeks for that to happen. And then after the equipment, the piece arrived, then they came back and fixed it. From the time that he called them to the time that it was repaired, it was 21 days. During harvest. Luckily, he had machinery from a neighbor that he could borrow and finish in time before, as we know, it's pretty volatile. Sometimes hail can come through and wipe out your crop, but we don't think 21 days is a timely manner. But you know, if it's we can't get there in a couple days, that's one thing. But we can't get there and get everything actually fixed within a few weeks. That's a big difference.
Senator Larson, you're next in line, and then Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was would be is the construction equipment is nearly identical to the farm equipment. So did this farm bill or include construction equipment?
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Larson. No, it did not. It's specifically called for agricultural equipment and having specific definitions that say equipment primarily used for agriculture, which did exclude construction equipment, airplanes that are used for agriculture. So if you crop dusters that are not included as well as vehicles primarily used for transportation. So it does call out specific exemptions, including construction equipment.
Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Too far away from the microphone. Just a general question about, I don't quite get that. I mean, the examples you gave were frankly, anecdotal. I mean, we're talking about somebody who called up, said that was the real reason. I don't know that. I'm in the repair. That's what I do, systems analysis.
Yeah.
So I need more clarification on exactly what you're trying to get to here, because I read the proposed language and it seemed like you're going to have to buy diagnostic equipment in some cases. You're going to have to purchase $20,000 worth of equipment to even get into this. I guess my big question is what do you think you're going to get? Because you got people that are experienced in these systems are much more complicated now. That's the reason why we're talking about it. But what are you going to get? I mean, you got a person who equipment's down, right? and it's thrown a code, some code. And I'm sure they could supply a manual that says this code means this. But beyond that, tell me, what exactly are you trying to get to? Are you trying to force dealerships into telling your people how to repair something with training they've had? I mean, that's my question. Is it just diagnostic equipment? Okay, I get that. You know, you can purchase it at a fair price is what I had read, which could be a lot of money. May not even be worth it, but I mean, you could get it. But I guess the impediment is what? You don't know what the codes are. I mean, that's kind of my general question is one. And the second question is why wouldn't this apply to automobiles and in construction equipment? I mean, I don't know if you're going to make the case that, and I agree with you, that these dealerships do hold proprietary information, more or less along the lines of some technical, usually like the technicians that you might call up for help. They won't talk to you unless you have an identification number, right? And maybe that's what you're getting to. I'm not sure exactly how this is gonna really work to dig down to a problem that, say, an experienced, trained technician would know, and you know, way beyond being a diesel mechanic. All right, to be honest with you, that everything's getting much more complicated, and I understand, but I guess how do you propose this is really going to help people when they have to buy all the equipment and when they have to have expertise and training in the background, you know, to say not have a 7-day delay in getting a part? But I mean, just tell me, I guess, how low you're going to go with how deep you're going to go, maybe is a better way of saying it, with your information that you're trying to get from the dealers or from the manufacturer, probably maybe more accurately. That, and why wouldn't it be more broader? Like, why wouldn't we also cover other equipment? What makes you folks special? I mean, besides you're in front of ag, but maybe that's the answer. But if you could answer those questions, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Coleman. I hope I answer all of them, and if I don't, please remind me. So first and foremost, the reason we are addressing agricultural equipment is because we represent farmers and ranchers. And it's been a problem for our members. And so that's the reason why we are addressing agricultural equipment. If you so decide to do other equipment, it's not something that we would have an issue with. It's just something that we don't advocate for, since we're not in construction or automobile space. As for the question of you know, what we're trying to get to and some of the anecdotal pieces, you know, because of some legislation and MOUs in Massachusetts, and then the build out from there, you have the ability to go to either own a piece of equipment yourself or to go to AutoZone and get a code for your car on what's going on. I'm not an experienced mechanic, and so I wouldn't fix something myself unless it's, you know, something quite simple that I know how to do. But and that's the same thing here, is that a farmer or rancher could, one, get the access to the codes to just tell them what's happening. Is it a sensor or is it something bigger? And if they know that they can replace a sensor or even a fuse or something along those lines, then if they know how to do that, then that's up to them. They can do that. If they don't, then they may want to take it to someone who's more experienced in that technological field, because, you know, there are a lot of people who don't understand the technological advances that have come with agricultural equipment. And what this simply is doing is not, what it's doing is it's giving the farmer or rancher, the owner of the equipment, the person who spent the money on the equipment, the ability to choose, do they want to fix it if they know how? Because some do. Do they take it to someone that is an independent repair provider? Because what I've heard from some of the people in our communities, that they have independent repair providers who used to work for one of the equipment manufacturers, who have since left and opened their own repair shop. So they would have that training, and it's up to them. You would hope that you would take it to your car to someone who is also well trained in that area. But if you feel like it's something that's really beyond your scope or the scope of someone else, you have that ability to still take it to the repair provider, but it's that freedom of choice that we're looking for amongst for our members.
Follow up?
Yeah, follow up, Mr. Chairman. Yes, maybe you just don't know this answer, obviously. It is more technical, but you got a CAN bus typically on a data communications bus in a system of a vehicle. My question is are you just looking to get access to what the codes mean? Or are you going to force them to sell whatever proprietary thing they've got to you to scan the CAN bus? I'm just using that as an example for automobiles. That's kind of, so are you just saying really you're trying to get a failure code that pops up on the dash and it says typical of, believe me, if they had failure codes that actually worked, they put me out of business. So I can assure you they don't. They give you a rough idea, but
Yeah.
Are you just looking for codes though? I mean, are you looking for codes that come up in a definition like a book that would have an index of what the codes mean, like the technicians get? Is that what you're thinking? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Kolb. That is one piece. Yes, it's getting access to the failure codes, things along those lines, and also the ability that if they can fix it, because now with a lot of the equipment, even if you have that and you fix the equipment, you still have to input like a 4-digit code to accept that, and so that's what they're looking for. And it's not the source code, and that was specifically called out in the Colorado legislation. No proprietary, like anything that would release a trade secret, and that was in Wyoming's as well, and not access to source code, which would give the proprietary trade secrets, but the embedded software that would allow you to get the scan of the code, fix the problem, and then get access to input that code to accept that repair. That's what they're looking for.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, just sitting here listening and having been on one side of that argument, you know, it seems what we're looking at here is what's the whole nation as an issue. We have a lack of labor force to come in. If you're sitting there 5 or 6 days and you think you know what it is, at least give me a chance instead of sitting there on my thumbs twiddling. And I think that's all we're looking for, is the ability. You know, I've watched my son-in-laws, they get out their phone and they get on Google and how do you fix this, you know, and you're going, holy moly, you know. But I think that's what we're looking for, just because there is not enough support in the industries, whether it be ag or industrial, to take care of our needs.
Mr. Chairman, let me take a shot at that. Representative Davis, you're absolutely right. Something that's changed in agriculture in my lifetime, and I'm a lifelong farmer and rancher in Southeast Wyoming. We used to deal with our local dealerships when we needed equipment. Well, in the last 2 years, 3 of my neighbors that I border have all bought tractors. They've all been different breeds, and they've all come through Big Iron. So the access to different equipment where there is no support mechanism or dealership within the state of Wyoming, and in some cases, nowhere within 500 miles of the state of Wyoming, it makes it necessary to be able to figure out a way when that piece of machinery that you got for 50 cents on a dollar breaks, how do you get it going again and get it back in the field? And that's the other issue that's manifesting itself in agriculture today.
Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Reading through this, it looks like one of the big fears of the farmer, the purchaser of equipment, is losing the warranty by taking it outside, which he still has the freedom to do. But if he does that and then violates the warranty, then that's where the trouble comes into play. Can you comment on how this legislation is it really enforceable if somebody does go out and has somebody repair it outside of the dealer that he bought it from? And how's that going to affect that warranty there? And if he does lose his warranty, he's still willing, I mean, he's still able to take that risk if he wants to. Thank you.
Mr. Zimmerman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, warranties are a piece of paper. And that's about all I can say about how good a warranty is. A warranty is going to depend an awful lot on the dealer that is going to service that warranty. Now, if you bought your tractor from somebody in Iowa and the local dealer had no input in that transaction, he's probably not going to pay as much attention to warranty work as he is on the guy he sold the tractor to. So warranties, I don't know that they're really as important as what we make them. Now, it depends on the operation. I've got neighbors that have $500,000, $600,000 John Deere tractors sitting in the yard. 3 of them may be lease tractors, and the other 2 are purchase tractors. They swear by the warranty because they feel that by having that warranty, when they've got their tractor broke down, the dealership they bought it from is going to provide them a loaner. So it all depends on the size of the ag operation, where the equipment was purchased, and what exactly is spelled out in the warranty.
Any additional question for Rocky Mountain Farmers Union? Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on the lines of working on the equipment and then potentially voiding your warranty, or more importantly, causing a safety hazard, as the manufacturers might think. Is there any issue with saying that if you work on said equipment, right, and you've made changes to it on your own, or maybe your independent mechanic has, that in fact the the manufacturer has no liability anymore for what goes on with that tractor? Is there any issues with making that clearly known? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Kolb. And yes, that's actually specifically outlined in the Colorado legislation, that if you or an independent repair provider do something to the equipment that is makes it unsafe, that it releases the dealer and the equipment original equipment manufacturer from liability. So putting that in there would be helpful, and we think it would be good to release them from liability if there is an issue like that.
Any more questions? All right. Mr. Zimmerman, you have anything to add?
Just as a close-up, thank you very much for taking up this issue. It's going to get more timely as we go forward in agriculture, as more types of machinery become more sophisticated. So I think now is the time to nip this in the bud, get a draft bill out there so farmers and ranchers, when they have that 5 minutes of free time every other week, they have a chance to read it and see what's being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you both for being here, and we'll
Thank you.
Probably see you again soon. All right, I think we'll move on to the equipment manufacturers and dealers. I don't know if there are any in the audience today. If they are, they can come forward. Otherwise, we'll I believe we have some online. Is that right, Katie? All right, if you could bring Mr. Ball in, that would be fantastic.
Good morning, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Ball, please introduce yourself and tell us who you're with.
Will do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the Ag Committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Russell Ball. I'm a territory sales manager with 21st Century Equipment, a John Deere dealership stretching across with 26 locations across the panhandle of Nebraska, Front Range to eastern Colorado, and we have 3 locations in Wyoming, those being Laramie, Cheyenne, and Torrington. Been with the dealership for 33 years, so I've seen quite a bit of technology come and go. I'd like to touch on what is already available to customers through our OEM John Deere and through 21st Century as a dealership. We do offer our customer electronic service tool that we call Customer Service Advisor for purchase. You know, they threw some numbers around earlier. I believe you can still buy a Customer Service Advisor with the software licensing, everything you need, for about $5,000, depending on the equipment you have as far as a laptop. it has to be a fairly robust one to handle it. We offer that. We offer all any special tooling that is available to us as a dealer is available to our customers. We do sell our customer service advisor through a centralized location. You call any one of our locations for it, and we get you in touch with a centralized person that understands it. The software licensing is able to help you out and get you going. To date, we've got 18 of those licenses operating across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. Some obviously with more success than others, but we do have 18 of them out there. In addition to that, we offer an 800 number for customer technical assistance. We call it CTAC, or Customer Technical Assistance Center. So if you have a trouble code come up, whether or not you own Customer Service Advisor, you can call that number and they can walk you through the diagnostic trouble code that you're getting and help you out from there. A lot of discussion about codes from Senator Kolb. Obviously, he has a little background there. More and more of the John Deere trouble codes, diagnostic trouble codes, come up on the vehicle itself. So you need no diagnostic tool of any type to get to the code. The operator's manual has many of the codes in it, not all of them. If you do have Customer Service Advisor, you're able to look up any John Deere diagnostic trouble code that exists on that machine and get to the diagnostic tree on how to solve that problem. Fewer than 10% of our shutdowns require any kind of a software push to a controller. And if you own Customer Service Advisor, you're able to do all of that. You can push some software to some controllers with Customer Service Advisor. You cannot change parameters regarding to emissions or safety. And honestly, neither can we as a dealer. If there's anything that needs changed in that area, we have to get a hold of our OEM, get the proper software from them and put it in. So little background there on what we do offer our customers, and more of them are buying it, and I hope they're using it successfully. So as a dealer in Colorado, I am based in Colorado, and I was there at the Right to Repair. There's really nothing available to our growers today that was not available to them prior to the passing of the bill. I don't think there was awareness that it was all available, but and it has heightened that for sure. But really, everything that's available today was available prior to the passing of the bill. It just wasn't being utilized. Let's see, I did want to say too that Senator Kolb mentioned having in an earlier comment, the training to do something with the trouble code. 21st Century Equipment, over 800 employees across our footprint. We've spent right at $1 million in training alone year to date, 2024 from January 1. Just training our people. It is a huge undertaking for sure. As part of our Customer Service Advisor sale, you can purchase, again, it's a purchase, but you can purchase a support package with that, where our people will try to keep you up to date on the software, on your diagnostic tool, and send you all the training that we get so that you can keep active and really utilize the tool that you purchased to the best of your abilities. So Colorado passed the bill. They hooped and hollered. They wanted to be the first state in the nation to pass it, and they got that done. Honestly, it's not been hugely effective, other than it did certainly raise awareness of the tools that are available. I do know that Cat and Case, and I believe New Holland, all have tools available. I don't know the cost. I can only speak to my OEM, which is John Deere. As far as the MOUs, Deere follows the MOU, and they will not allow us as a dealer to not follow that MOU. They they have a lot of pressure they can apply on us, and we do follow John Deere's rules, whether we like it or not. And we do. Honestly, the MOU is not a problem for us. We were trying to comply to that prior to the bill. We're still trying to comply with that. I spoke to consolidation of dealerships. You know, we did consolidate with Four Rivers. We did not close any locations. All locations are still open. We have tried to hire and have hired at some of them. So there's still the same locations available to growers. Hopefully there's better people there, better trained people. We try to use our size and scope to allow us to hire the best of the best and constantly update our training and our abilities to keep our customers up and running. No one gains, the OEM, the dealership, the grower, no one gains downtime. No one wants downtime. Deere would like to put out a unit that never broke down, but these things operate in fairly harsh environments, and man made them, so man will break them. So consolidation, I understand the concern, but you know, in my opinion, it should get better with consolidations. You get stronger dealerships trying to support the customers out there. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would address any questions anyone would have.
Thank you, Mr. Ball. Any questions from the committee? Representative Banks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ball. So we heard from the farmers that the MOUs they're not comfortable with because it's not binding. And so in your testimony, we heard that really the legislation didn't affect the manufacturers because those things were already available. So in your professional opinion, if we were to enact legislation similar to Colorado, it wouldn't hurt you, wouldn't put you guys in a bad place. It would just kind of cement into statute what's already happening. Do I understand that correctly?
Mr. Ball.
Thank you, Representative Banks. No, not entirely. When I didn't say that John Deere wasn't affected, obviously they spend a lot of time, effort, and money protecting their proprietary rights that they have spent billions of dollars perfecting. And as a dealer, obviously I have things I should be doing today other than this. So it is very important to us. I don't feel the need for any legislation in this area. Colorado was after several things that we were able to get worked out of the bill in Colorado. We feel like we were fairly successful in getting it to something manageable. But I know you guys are legislators, and I know you have important topics to handle, but I don't see any need to legislate something that's already happening. That would be my opinion. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions from the committee for Mr. Ball? All right, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Ball. Thanks for testifying and being with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Who's next on our list? Katie. All right, if we can bring in Mr. Cranmore. All right, Mr. Cranmore, you might be on mute. We can't hear you, but we still can't hear you. Do we have anybody else on the waiting list, Katie, we could go to and maybe get back to Mr. Cranmore? which that might also be Mr. Cranmore. Katie, are any of our other folks lined up on that have signed up?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I apologize. I'm out on a demo, on-site demo, and I'm a little bit remote, and my connection's not very good.
All right, well, please proceed.
still-
Introduce yourself. Tell us.
Yep.
Yep, tell us who you're with and give us your testimony, please.
Okay, I am Quentin Cranmore. I am with Titan Machinery. I am the general manager for 2 locations in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and Torrington, Wyoming. I have been asked to speak today just on behalf of Titan Machinery, and I guess the biggest thing from our point of view is that we do a lot of things to make both tools and parts and everything available to our customers, our independent repair shops, everything in the way of that. We have about 13 employees in Torrington, 25 in Scottsbluff. We spend a lot of time and money in training, trying to make sure that these people are able to be there to support our customers, not let alone in vehicles and everything else, but we do everything we can to be there in a timely manner. Like I said, we have ESTs that customers are available to purchase, whether it be an independent repair shop or a individual customer, and they have access to all that stuff. We in Torrington, I think we service about 5 independent repair shops. The technical knowledge that it takes for a lot of these, especially the electronic tools and things like that, is way beyond a lot of the capabilities of some people, and that's where our training and all the money that we spend on training and tools to do that. We also, in all of our locations, we give out a lot of free advice over the phone, and we try to help people as much as we can. But it usually comes to some point, unless it's something simple where the customer is going to probably have to bring the machine in, or we're going to have to go out to that piece of equipment. Many people, it's no different for me with my vehicle, but I don't have the time nor the want to repair my own stuff. That's why I have a dealership, and that's why I rely on the manufacturer to support product they sell through the dealership. A lot of times I wouldn't have the understanding on how to do that anyway. So I think it's really important, that people have the opportunity to repair their own stuff, and the tools and everything that are necessary to do that. I would say in most cases that I've been a part of, most people really don't want to repair their own stuff. They really want to be able to rely on the people who have been trained and are skillful in this industry, in any industry as far as this repair goes, in order to keep them, their machines going and being productive at all times. So the other thing is we have a lot of connected vehicles, so we are able to diagnose a lot of things remotely without sending out a technician or something like that. Or we can find out something remotely, and we're able to send parts along with that technician when they go out the first time. So there's a lot of new technology that has allowed us to remotely service a lot of this equipment, whether it be software or knowing what the problem is before we actually get on site. That's what I have today. Thank you.
Questions from the committee for Mr. Cranmore? All right, seeing none. Thanks for joining us today. Good luck on your demo.
Sorry about the confusion. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Katie, do we have anyone else? All right. Public comment on right to repair.
Mr. Chairman, Keith Kennedy on behalf of the Wyoming Wheat Growers Association. I'll go over a little bit of brief history. There were some questions asked about when all of this started, and really it started with the EPA's Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4 requirements for diesel, off-road diesel engines. So Tier 2 was final in 2006, and that was really when the first instance of needing to know codes or being able to, from what I've heard from producers, the real problem isn't necessarily diagnosing and completing a physical repair. It's often being able to ascertain the proper code to allow the machine to operate, because even though the repair's been made, the software still believes that there is an issue that the machine should not operate because it might cause damage to the machine. Tier 3 was final in 2009 and Tier 4 was final in 2016. It's also important to remember that the software-driven devices now also control both the transmission and the hydraulics of just a tractor. And then when we get into more complicated machinery, it may also control other portions of the operation of the equipment. The other thing to remember is that much of this also integrates geographic information systems. So we have essentially a third or fourth layer of software on top of this. And so, yes, it does require somebody who has deep technical expertise, but often a frustration for a farmer may be that they have completed a repair or changed a filter of some type, but they can't get the machine to operate because they don't have the code to tell the machine that everything's been taken care of. And that's kind of the short of that. The only other thing that I would point out, that within the last 3 months, agriculture's technological dependence showed up in a very big way. And if you'll recall that there were some solar flares around the 20th of May, and a huge number of the corn planters in the Midwest were shut down for about 2 days because they didn't have any GIS signal that they were able to plant with. And since the time I was on the farm, on a lot of places, those markers, those physical markers that we used to use, have disappeared in favor of the technology. And when the technology goes bad, you're left with basically a wing and a prayer to decide where that planter should go in the field. Some of that had actually showed up in 2001. Immediately after September 11th, the few folks who had adopted that technology had found that the Department of Defense can vary that signal based on emergencies. And so folks that were actually out planting wheat at that time found that they were back to citing where the planter should go rather than following that GIS signal that was moving them back and forth 2 to 3 foot then, where before the accuracy, before that variance was created, that variance was only 3 or 4 inches. So with that, I'd welcome any questions you might have, but I can't guarantee any answers.
All right, committee questions for Mr. Kennedy, Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that testimony, Mr. Kennedy. This legislation, from what you just testified to, I guess I don't really know what your opinion is of whether this legislation helps those situations or not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, my issue here is I am not certain how much we can affect this. And one of the manufacturers' biggest issues with independents having access to codes, particularly with the engine, is
with respect to emissions? Because as I understand it, the OEM is still responsible if an alteration has been made that takes an engine out of the EPA compliance. And I don't know that a state law can relieve them of that liability that EPA is essentially attached for the life of the equipment.
Additional questions for Mr. Kennedy? All right, seeing none. Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Kennedy. Thanks for being with us. Any additional public comment? Katie? All right. In the meantime, let's let Mr. Magagna proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with Wyoming Stockholder Association. I'll be very brief. We've had a policy adopted by our membership for the last 5 years that supported legislative efforts to draft some and pass some legislation of this type. That policy was set to expire this year, and at our convention just last week, our membership unanimously renewed that policy. Beyond that, I realize there are a lot of details and concerns here, and this is not my field of expertise. I'll rely on the other people you've had testifying on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Magagna. Any questions for stock growers? All right. Thank you. Any luck, Katie? All right, Mr. Franken, if you could introduce yourself and tell us who you're with.
I'm Jeff Franken. I'm with Cheyenne Kubota and Front Range Kubota in Colorado. And
go ahead and give us your testimony, if you would, please.
I run 3 dealerships, 2 in Colorado, 1 in Cheyenne. We're kind of a small family outfit. We believe in if somebody's down, if they are in the field or they in construction, they're first in line. They make their living that way. I don't see where this is going to help any of them. If somebody calls and they're a customer and they're out in the field, our service writers, service managers will do everything in their power to make sure they get up and running without dragging equipment in. I don't see where making a law is going to help that process whatsoever.
All right. Do we have any questions from the committee for Mr. Franken? Representative Slagle.
Yeah, Mr. Franken, I guess the question I would ask, you say you don't see any benefit in making this law. I guess, do you see there could be harm to your dealership by making a law like this?
Mr. Franken?
Not really. If people want to work on their stuff at home, that's perfectly fine. We welcome that, but I don't see what benefit it would make of them. It certainly wouldn't harm us. We stay busy enough.
Any more questions from the committee? All right, Mr. Franken, thanks for being with us today. You have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope, that's it.
All right, thank you for zooming in with us. All right, I think that's all the testimony on the right to repair committee. What is your pleasure on this particular issue? Senator Kolb.
Yeah, just a question, if you'd allow me to ask, is more of a manufacturer's clarification. Specifically, if you had an owner of a piece of equipment while it was in warranty, work on said equipment, does that typically void the warranty with that manufacturer? Is that how that would work? I just want clarification if I could get that, Mr. Chairman.
And who would you like to ask that question
Any
of?
manufacturer, I suppose, Mr. Chairman. You're the chairman. I'll leave it up to you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think we've lost all of them already,
Oh,
so we may have to ask that. If we continue with the issue, we can ask them at the next meeting and follow up, but I think we've,
All right,
that tractor has sailed.
that ship sailed. Okay, thank you.
All right, committee, what is your pleasure on the issue?
I'd move the bill draft, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
The one we're currently working on, the Freedom to Repair Act.
So Senator Kolb, do you want to proceed with the 17 or the 18 bill draft?
The 18 bill draft.
Okay. Second's agreeable to that. So it's been moved by Senator Kolb, seconded by Representative Conrad. Do we have any discussion on the issue to proceed with the bill draft to review at our next meeting? All right, Senator Kolb.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Specifically to address the issue of avoiding the manufacturer's warranty if said equipment's worked on. I think it's absolutely not an issue once it's out of warranty. If you have the right to blow up your equipment or to make it run, I mean, you own it. But I think it would be, in my mind, unenforceable to say the manufacturer would have to continue a warranty after a modification was done, to honor their original warranty if you've modified the said item, because sometimes things happen you don't even realize when you're trying to make a repair. So I would just want to make that clear that we would have that as an option to discuss in our next meeting, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Anna, do you remember if that's in the 18 bill draft, that language addressing that issue?
I don't believe it is, but I believe, if I recall correctly, it might be in the Colorado legislation, so I could copy it out of there if that's the committee's pleasure.
I think it'd be good to go ahead and put that language in our bill draft for the next meeting, and we can talk about it then and have a chance to review it. All right, any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you, Anna. All right, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and so I think we'll take a break till right at 10 o'clock to start our eminent domain discussion. All right, we're back from our break and our next topic for discussion is eminent domain. And first thing we're going to do is hear from LSO.
Mr. Chairman, would you just like me to go over the memo or would you like me to go over the bill drafts from last year as well?
So let's go over the memo and then maybe just give us kind of a brief synopsis of the bill drafts. We don't need to go through them in depth, but just remind us of what we did, please.
Of course. Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I've created an eminent domain memo for your review. This memo outlines easement standards that are required before an easement will be granted through eminent domain. The United States and the Wyoming constitutions require that private property will not be taken unless just compensation is given to the landowner. In particular, I looked at Barlow Ranch versus Green Corps Pipeline. It's the most prominent court case regarding easement standards and eminent domain to come out of Wyoming in recent years. I believe it came out in 2013. Easements generally fall under the category of partial takings due to their only occupying part of a property owner's land, such as for a pipeline or an energy collector line. For a partial taking, the measure of compensation is either the value of the property rights taken or the amount by which the fair market value of the entire property is reduced by the taking, whichever is greater. And fair market value can be determined in many different ways. There are a couple of examples, such as sales of property comparable to the condemned property, or any method of valuation that is just and equitable if there's no relevant market establishing the value of the property. Fair market value and comparable sales must be based upon arm's length transactions between willing buyers and willing sellers, and compensation can be given as a lump sum payment or an installment payment through the life of the easement. The owner of an easement is said to have all rights over the easement as are necessary, but if he exceeds his rights in the manner or extent of the use of the easement, he becomes a trespasser. When determining whether an easement would be in the public interest and necessary, courts in Wyoming look at 3 criteria. First, the public interest and necessity required of the project. 2, the project will be most compatible with the greatest public good and the least private injury. And 3, the property sought to be acquired is necessary for the project. Once an easement is no longer in use, the easement owner is responsible for reclamation and restoration of the property to the condition it was in before the condemnation, to the extent that that's possible. And then Wyoming statute 126.815A describes the reasons the right of eminent domain may be granted, including for electrical power transmission lines and distribution systems, and for the transportation of oil and gas from any well. And then in your packets, you also have 2 bills from last year. The first one is Senate File 10, which is eminent domain energy collector systems. Basically, this sets out standards for the placement of electrical transmission lines through eminent domain. So basically, before a person may exercise the power of eminent domain, the person has to negotiate and have finalized land use and compensation agreements with at least 85% of the land on which the collector system will be constructed, or have negotiated with not less than 85% of the owners of the land. Proof to the court of compliance with those requirements is required by this bill draft. And then as far as determining what fair market value is of the land that is condemned, you might want to consider mirroring the requirements in the Barlow case, such as changing the language so that it states that the measure of compensation is either the value of the property rights taken or the amount by which the fair market value of the entire property is reduced by the taking, whichever is greater. The bill draft also says that a commercial facility generating electricity shall not use an existing easement to place additional collector systems without first complying with this section. And this bill draft doesn't apply to a public utility that's been granted a certificate of public convenience by the PSC. It also gives definitions of collector system associated with the commercial facility generating electricity and commercial facility commercial facility generating electricity. That's the important parts of Senate File 10 from last year. And then as to Senate File 11, it basically just removes reference to wind energy throughout Wyoming statute 126.815D. It makes the subsection applicable to all collector systems associated with commercial facilities generating electricity. And no person except a public utility that has been granted a certificate of public convenience and necessity can exercise the condemnation authority granted by this section. It also prohibits the commercial facility generating electricity from using an existing easement to place additional collector systems associated with the commercial facility generating electricity. And I would stand for any questions on the bill drafts or on the memo.
Thank you, Anna. Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. A question for you in your research and preparing for this. How many cases have there been of eminent domain in, say, the past 10 years in the state of Wyoming, to give us some perspective on how many or how impactful this is?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I didn't see a whole lot in the last 10 years. Most eminent domain cases that came out of the Wyoming Supreme Court are before 2013 or before then. So, I mean, I could probably count on one hand how many have come out in the last 10 years.
Follow up.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As well as a follow-up there, if I understood correctly, there has been no eminent domain cases in the last 10 years in the state of Wyoming.
I think there's been a few, but not very many, like probably less than 5.
Thank you.
Representative Slagle.
I would just like to remind Representative Conrad of Karen Bud Fallon's testimony, I believe a year ago when we were, and they had an eminent domain case brought against them, and it got resolved before it actually went to court. But so, I mean, it does happen, and companies are using eminent domain to get across property.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers here, but a number of years we looked at this when we updated the eminent domain. So there's 2 issues, and I want to make sure that I understand the question. One, are you talking about how many times the use of eminent domain was exercised in the state of Wyoming, or how many times there was litigation associated with eminent domain? And so I'm not sure exactly, Representative Conrad, what your question was. It both of those or one of those?
Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator Hicks, thank you for the clarification. I actually both. I was just trying to get some perspective on, is this an issue? Is it a growing issue? Is it increasing threefold, et cetera, with this promotion of wind energy and or solar, et cetera? Thank you.
And that might be a good question when we get to Karen. She might give us some perspective on that, as she's dealt with a lot of those cases, and she might be able, because Senator Hicks makes a good point. There's probably not a public record of a lot of that stuff. A lot of that happens between the utility and the landowners, and so I think Karen might be able to give us the best information, because otherwise I don't know where you're going to go for it. That one's going to be a little bit tricky to track down.
And Mr. Chairman, I know a couple of years ago when we modified some of the eminent domain laws, those numbers were actually generated, and my recollection is the largest user of eminent domain in the state of Wyoming is the Wyoming Department of Transportation. And so every time they move or widen a road, I remember the road up there in Park County, I think just on that one road between Powell and Cody, when they widened that highway, there was 230 some cases of eminent domain by WYDOT. But it happens a lot more than you would think. Even if we can't get the updated numbers, I know those numbers are available back to that 2014 legislation, sometime in that time frame. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify your question. Thank you.
Thank you, committee, for the discussion. Any other questions for LSO and the work Anna's done for us? All right, seeing none, let's move on to Ms. Bud Fallon. Proceed when it works for you, Karen.
Okay, so can you hear me?
We can, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I wasn't sure. All right, thank you very much, committee. Mr. Chairman, my name is Karen Bud Fallon. I am an attorney in Cheyenne, Wyoming. We have 7 members of our law firm, and I would say at least half of the work we do deals with issues regarding easements, rights of way, eminent domain, and trying to end up with easements before we ever end up at an eminent domain issue. Just to get the question out of the way first, the problem in Wyoming is that we don't have a database that you can go to track the number of cases filed. In the federal system, the courts use what they call PACER, so I can put in a search term and search all the federal courts, and I can come up with the number of cases filed. Wyoming doesn't have that for state courts, and eminent domain cases would be filed in a state court in like Cody or Sublette County or wherever you're at, and there's no tracking of the number of complaints filed. Normally, I would tell you that the letters that are filed, which are also not of public record, or the cases filed, 99% of those get settled. And the main reason for the settlement is that the only thing you're litigating over in an eminent domain case is money. You're not litigating over whether liability is covered, how the right-of-way works, who is responsible for reclamation. None of that stuff is included in an eminent domain case. The only thing that's litigated is money. And so most of the time, because the legal standard for just simple payment is so low, the truth is most people settle them because you're going to end up paying more money to fight the thing in court than you are just taking a settlement. And there's just simply no way to track that now until we get a better system in the Wyoming for the Wyoming courts to be able to track complaints. So unfortunately, even though I'd be happy to try to look up and find an answer, I'm just not going to be able to do that. What I prepared today is I have looked at the two bills that you had last year, Senate File 11 and Senate File 10. I generally support these bills, being an attorney that does a whole lot of this stuff. But I think there's some problems with the bills that I would ask you to look at and maybe reconsider. If you start with Senate File 11, I have a couple of things to note. The first thing is this all relies on whether you get a certificate of necessity from the PUC. I will tell you that the landowners are severely disadvantaged by having to go to Cheyenne and argue their case in front of the PUC. I own some property between Dwyer Junction and Guernsey, and last year Black Hills issued a 60-day notice letter on that private property to say they were going to file eminent domain over the Black Hills line. Getting all those landowners in that group organized, getting them to Cheyenne, we had to intervene in the PUC hearings. We ended up intervening late because the way the system works is that landmen will come out and individual by individual by individual and try to come up with easements before the PUC ever is notified or before there's any public notice. They don't file with the county first. They try to get their easements. And that's a real problem when you're talking about landowners that live bilingual and are trying to figure out how in the world do I hire an attorney? Do I deal with Cheyenne? Do I deal with the Public Utilities Commission? And so one of the things in this bill I would like to see is that there is at least notice provided to, say, the county commission or to a local governing body before any of this has ever started. Because I think if the landowners have notice, if the county has notice, then I think that the public is going to be much better served, and it's not going to be sort of this secret little proceeding until it's halfway over, and then they all get together and figure out they've got to have an attorney and try to deal with it. So I'd really like to see an upfront notice provision in Senate File 11, that if you've got a utility, if you've got somebody looking at a wind farm and thinking about doing collector lines, all of that needs to notice the county commission before they ever start talking to landowners about making a deal on their property. I just think it's good governance for the county to know and the landowners to know before they ever start. So that was my comment on Senate File 11. If you look at Senate File 10, I actually had more issues with this bill. If you go to page 2, line 5, the legal citation is incorrect. It should be cited to 1-26-704 instead of 818. So that we just need to make that citation correction. I will tell you, I do like the 85% requirement that a collector system has to negotiate a deal with 85% of the landowners before they can condemn the other 15. I do understand that there are landowners that are just cranky and difficult and are going to stand in a project no matter how good the project is. I understand that. But I truly do not believe, after doing this for 35 years, that 90% of Wyoming landowners are those people. I also think Wyoming's got precedent for that, and that if you're doing an oil and gas unit, you have to have a certain percentage of people agreeing before you can force others into the unit. So this isn't some brand new concept that Wyoming has never dealt with. Oil and gas companies are already used to that. And so I don't see why collector systems can't be included in that same sort of percentage, because that's something that people in Wyoming are used to. If you go to page 3, lines 4 through 15, the truth is that's where I have the most problem with this bill. I think the language on lines 6 through 9 with regard to the average consideration, including terms and conditions of other landowners, I'm not totally sure what that means. I think if you are, I think it only is going to look at maybe one landowner instead of the collection of the 85 landowners. I think we need to massage that language some to make sure that that they're looking at all of the landowners. And if you go to line 11, it's talking about fair market value. I think we need to really be sure to include what fair market value is defined by the Barlow case, which is the case that your attorney talked about. That was a very important case in Wyoming. We represented the Wyoming stock growers in that case. What that case talks about is easements, other easements on the same piece of land, not other easements up and down the line. And so we need to really be sure to keep that case a viable case. Yes?
Sorry, my mic keeps cutting out on me. Anyways, I was just gonna clarify for the record, you said page 3, but I think you're actually talking about page 4.
Oh, I apologize. Yes, sir.
Lines 4 through 15.
Okay. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
We got that cleared up. That was exciting. All right.
I'm sorry.
Please proceed. No, it's not your fault. It's mine. So thank you.
So again, on that whole subparagraph C, we need to make sure that the compensation terms fall in line with the I know you all called it the Green Court case. We called it the Barlow case because it was Barlow's land that was condemned. And that is such good language. In fact, we haven't found that good of language in any other court case in any of the surrounding states where we deal with the eminent domain issues. On page 4, at the very bottom, the end of line 22 and 23, it says, or the infrastructure already existing. I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. So does that mean if I already have other infrastructure on my property, I can't say no to a collector line? I just wasn't totally clear on what that language was intended to say. If you go to page 5, I'm not sure why lines 12 through 15 are an exception. The committee may have had a reason to put in that exception before. I just didn't know what it was. So that's all I had on that bill. The other thing, just to let you know, and I haven't totally worked my way through this yet, but I was made aware that the state of Utah in this last legislative session adopted a bill on liability and a payment fund to help reimburse for liability caused by mostly catastrophic fire. Because as you know, if a line blows down or if a pole blows down and it starts a fire, that can be a huge problem, particularly for the landowner. I can commit to you that I can look at this in the next couple of weeks and see if something like this would work for the state of Wyoming. But it's the fire liability issue that's something that we worry about the very most when we're doing our landowner agreements. Because once a fire starts, the rancher can't wait 2 or 3 years, litigate whether he should get paid or not. A lot of easements will say that the landowner is liable for acts of God. And, if say the wire is loose, the wind blows like it always does in Wyoming, you're going to be litigating forever whether the fact that the line was loose or whether it was the wind that caused the fire. And I think we need to have a way to get relief faster than that instead of litigating for years. And we have had cases where we've had to litigate for years before the landowner ever got paid for the fact that his hay meadow burned or his rangeland burned. And obviously you can't use that for a couple of years. So I think we ought to look at this liability fund language. I did read the Utah bill once. I think it's too complicated. I think we could pare it down for Wyoming. But I would encourage you to look at something like a liability fund or a way that we could get payments out to the landowners faster than years of litigation. So with that, I would close my testimony. I will be here for the full hour. If you have questions now or later, I'd be happy to answer them.
One question I have, Ms. Bud Fallon, and so on our agenda, it has you listed as talking about minimum easement standards, and I didn't know if you've already done that or if you had additional thoughts regarding that very specific topic.
Okay. I do have some thoughts on that specific topic. The minimum easement standards, I think that we need to include are reclamation for the property, the whole issue of liability, and a faster, better way to make the liability, to get the liability paid are the two biggest issues that I see. We also work very hard when we're negotiating these things to encourage fair market value, or what we see as higher fair market value. I will tell you that the liability issue was where we had the biggest hangup with Black Hills. Black Hills wanted to pay a smaller easement value if they were going to take on more of the liability. Black Hills' argument was basically that well, you know, we're going to put up these electrical towers in a safe manner, therefore we should not bear liability. The landowner's argument is, look, I wouldn't have any fire liability if you wouldn't have put up the towers. If you wouldn't have stretched the lines, there would be no liability. And that was probably the biggest fight we had and took the most months to settle, because Black Hills said, okay, if we take on the liability, we want to cut your landowner payments in half, even though they're taking farm ground or ag ground and making it into an industrial use. So those are the biggest issues that I see. I did see some draft bills that were created by this committee. Quite frankly, I thought they were fairly complicated. And I think with some drafting and some looking at them, we could make them less complicated. And I don't think you have to provide actual language for liability. We just need to say that any easement needs to include certain kind of standards, and then leave that at the individual discretion.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Bud Fallon. Any questions from the committee? Representative Banks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to speak a little bit to the liability issue about that. So the Minerals Committee actually had the sponsors of that Utah legislation that Ms. Bud Fallon referenced at our last meeting. And we came away from that meeting going forward, drafting a bill that would mirror that Utah legislation that would deal with this liability concern. With your permission, Karen, I will ask Chairman Dockstead and Burghardt to reach out to you for any additional thoughts you might have regarding that. But because it was associated a lot with Rocky Mountain Power and the fires and those things, we wanted to combine the liability all into one, kind of like Utah did. So we're trying to address that issue with a draft legislation coming forth from the Minerals Committee, just so you're aware of that.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I was not aware of that.
Yes, ma'am.
But I would be happy to look at it. I do think it's a really good concept. And so let me think about the specifics and then figure out how we make sure that it applies in this case as well.
Thank you for that. Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had mentioned on Senate File 11, maybe the topic of notification to the county commissioners. Do you think that, do you have an example of where to put that? Or do you think that might be better put in a minimum easement standards?
Miss Bud Fallon.
Mr. Chairman, I think you could do it either way. The two bills that I was sent to look at for this hearing were Senate File 10 and Senate File 11. But if we put it somewhere else, I think that would be fine too. I just think that that's one of the huge problems with almost all eminent domain is you get landowners out, or I'm sorry, you get landmen out, they isolate the landowner, and then you get 3/4 of it done on, quite frankly, what I don't think is a very good easement without anybody even knowing that it's happening. And I think that's very poor practice.
Representative Slagle.
Thank you, Karen, for the information you've given us. Kind of a follow-up to that last question. I guess do you think that putting that notice language onto Senate File 10 would also be something we could do?
Ms. Bud Fallon.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I think you could do it either way, put it on an easement standard bill or put it in this bill. Quite frankly, I think that is so important that I think that it should go on whatever bill you think the legislature is going to pass, because I think that initial notice so that everyone is on the same page before landmen start going out is just critical if we're going to start dealing with some of the issues we're having from collector systems, from wind energy, from almost anything. I think the county commissioners are the body of government closest to the people. And I think that ought to be the first stop for any company doing business, is to stop at the county commission so that the citizens of the county understand what's happening in their county. And very often, quite frankly, it's the last stop.
Follow up?
Thank you. That answers that question. I think that's important as well. Another question I would ask is, I know CO2 pipelines has been discussed a lot in mineral committee meetings, and the use of eminent domain was discussed there as well, not more from the standpoint of using it to get them put in rather than limiting it. I was wondering if you thought, and I know our bills in Wyoming are supposed to be one topic bills, and basically this is eminent domain energy collector systems. Maybe we need to change the title, but if we need to add CO2 pipelines as well for this eminent domain stuff. Just your thoughts on that, Karen?
Ms. Bud Fallon.
Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of torn on what I think is the right answer to that. I think if you make these bills too large and encompass too many things, then they get so watered down, or you've got all these companies that are going to oppose your efforts to begin with. And so in my mind, in some cases, I think it's better to have a narrowly focused bill so that, quite frankly, you don't have so many enemies. On the other hand, I could see where coordination is important so that you don't have CO2 lines held to one standard and collector lines held to a different standard. So I actually think that's more of a political call, and you guys know the people in the Wyoming legislature far better than I do. And you would know what's possible and what is not.
And any more questions for Ms. Bud Fallon from the committee? All right. I have one question, Ms. Bud Fallon, and that's back to your notice suggestion. How do you envision that working? Is that a notice just to the county commissioners? Are we requiring them to put a notice? Would we be requiring them to put a notice in the newspaper? What exactly are you thinking with that? Because let's assume it's just to the county commissioners. I don't know what, a lot of our counties don't have this, the resolutions or regulations regarding wind and solar that some of the counties do. And so I don't know what a notice to them actually does. So I'm just kind of wondering what you're thinking there and how we would word that.
Mr. Chairman, even if a county does not have a zoning ordinance or regulations regarding wind or solar or whatever the deal is, the real purpose in my mind is to provide notice to the citizens that this is happening in my county. I'm not suggesting that counties take on any more regulation. If the county wants to regulate it, they've got the zoning process. That's totally up to them. But I got to tell you, it's really frustrating in these cases when somebody calls and says, I need an attorney. to go out and find that half the easements are already written, and quite frankly, they're usually not very good because nobody knew that a company was talking to their neighbors. I think trying to say that there's written notice to every person affected, I mean, I don't want to be too onerous, but it seems to me that the county commission and them at least putting the notices on their agenda would be a way that most people would be able to be involved. My problem with putting it in the newspaper is you'd put it in the back in the public notice section. And I think there's only about 20 people in Wyoming that actually read the public notices in the back of the newspaper.
All right. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Karen, I have a question for you, and I don't know if would be applicable here. But on Senate file number 11, on page 2, line 6 there, would it be overzealous, I guess is the word, that I would put on there that after generating electricity that is intended to offset fossil fuel generating facilities? Is something like that applicable in there so that granted by this section there? Would that be?
Miss Bud Fallon.
I'm thinking a second. So I think the more that you add exceptions and caveats, the more it's full-time employment for an attorney to figure out how do I couch my project so that it doesn't fall within the exception that they've created. And so if you put in there something about offsetting fossil fuel or intended to offset fossil fuel, I think a clever attorney can just figure out how to say, well, that's not what I'm doing something else, and then it would defeat the purpose.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for Miss Bud Fallon? All right, Karen, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate your expertise. You may hang tight for a few minutes until we finish up the topic, if you don't mind.
I'm happy to do that.
All right. All right, thank you. We're now on to public comment. Do we have any public comment online? I don't see any there might be some in the room. So if you'd come up, Mr. McGagnon, we'll start with those present on public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon, Wyoming Stockholders Association. I will confine my comments largely to Senate File 10. As some of you may recall, that was some previous legislation that had been drafted but not introduced back in 2012. And I brought this to you last year as a starting point for our discussions, thinking it represented a fair way to move forward. Before getting into just a few things there, and particularly addressing some of the issues that the previous speaker brought up, I do want to point out one thing. It was brought out that there are cases that involve litigation because of eminent domain. Then there are those that involve eminent domain but don't lead to litigation. The third factor that I think is really important is that in regular negotiation that leads to agreements short of eminent domain, there's always that threat hanging over the negotiator, the landowner, that if I don't reach an agreement, I'm going to be facing eminent domain. So it not only influences those who get involved in eminent domain, but it influences the agreements that are reached to avoid the use of eminent domain. I think that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. Looking at this bill and a couple of things that were mentioned, and I'll just be brief, but on page 4, certainly would be supportive of some changes to bring in the standards that come from the Barlow decision as Ms. Bud Fallon mentioned, we were interveners in that decision and believe that the standards we established there would be very helpful if brought into that section, if you choose to move forward with this bill. The issue was raised down on line 22, page 4. Unless specified in an existing easement, et cetera, the intent there, and perhaps it can certainly be clarified, was to say that if you've got an easement, you've got power lines going across this land, you can add additional capacity, but you can't add any, your easement doesn't entitle you to put up additional lines or anything without a new negotiation unless it's specified in the original easement. Again, moving on to page 5, the exception on lines 12 through 15 probably could be clarified very much, but the intent there was to say that we're dealing with the collector lines, not with the substations where the collector lines interconnect with existing transmission lines, and to separate those two out. So I think those are just some reasons why those are there, and undoubtedly they can likely be improved if this bill were to go forward. The other thing I would mention, I thought that Ms. Bud Fallon brought forward some excellent points that need to be involved in eminent domain negotiations and processes, irrespective of whether eminent domain or not in eminent domain, in right-of-way easement negotiations, irrespective of eminent domain. I guess my thought would be that because this bill is intended to focus on once the eminent domain process is brought into play, this is how it works out, that you would give careful thought to saying perhaps we need a separate piece of legislation, unless it happens to be in that bill that's coming from the Minerals Committee, to address how the various things such as liability and reclamation and the other factors have been raised that should be a part of any easement negotiation, irrespective of whether eminent domain comes into play. So I would urge that you give some thought to that. With that, Mr. Chairman, this is the bill of the two that were introduced last year that we fully supported. The reason we had some concerns with Senate File 11 is, as has been mentioned already, that one small landowner with an acre that has to be crossed can in effect preclude a landowner who stands to benefit greatly from having energy facilities located on their land, say a wind farm that they voluntarily agreed to, and then other landowners who feel that the offers that have been made to them for collector lines are sufficiently rewarding that they're happy to go forward with those and see a benefit from them, and then being precluded from doing so by perhaps a single small landowner who just says no to everything. So that's why we strongly prefer Senate File 10 to Senate File 11, with whatever changes you might choose to make in Senate File 10. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McGagnon. Any questions? Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clarifying question, Mr. McGagnon. So are you or are you not in favor of the 85%?
Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, we are in favor of the 85%. That percentage came out of that original legislation. Certainly it's open for discussion. Should it be 80? Should it be 90? Whatever, but we're comfortable with the 85.
Thank you.
Additional questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. McGagnon. Any additional public comment? Mr. Moline, you're taking a break from moving, I see, to chat with us about eminent domain. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. Certainly agree with the comments of the previous speakers. An instance with one of my members on a pipeline to help shift the burden to the landowners. They were at least implicitly, if not explicitly, they were required to carry a additional liability policy over and above their normal ranch policy. in order for that help facilitate the easement of the pipeline through their property. I do find it ironic that if something would happen, that the landowner bears any responsibility of something that's not his fault. It's, if a pipeline blows, power line blows down, it should be the responsibility of the facility owner, not of the landowner. And I will say that eminent domain is used quite extensively. I think in almost every easement where the one side has eminent domain, it's very implicit that they have that power, and that puts them in a much stronger bargaining position than the people that it could be exercised on them. So I think it's used a lot, just doesn't go as far as going all the way to court. I think those are the main points I want to make. I do understand having a percentage. If they voluntarily, most landowners have signed an easement. I do understand that you shouldn't have one rotten apple spoil the whole barrel. And one more example of the wind projects, what happens so often is that the people that get the towers are very excited to get them. They're making bank. They're doing quite well with them. The people that have to put up with the collector lines, there's really no benefit for them. They can't use those lines. And so I think, putting some more requirements on those where you truly don't want them, you don't get a benefit. A pipeline's a little more unique. Nobody wants it. Everybody's in agreement that nobody wants a pipeline through their property along the whole route. The collector lines are a little different animal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would take any questions and speak slow. So the longer I take here, the less I have to help unpack.
Thank you, Mr. Moline. Any questions from the committee? All right, I'm sorry. Oh, we got one. You're lucking out here. Senator French has a question for you.
Yeah, I just couldn't help myself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why do we talk about fair market value? Why not 2 times fair market value or something? Because if you have a piece of property and somebody's coming across with an easement of some kind for whatever, that is a permanent, whatever the word is, on your deed, on your land. I think they should be compensated at a minimum more than just fair market value. That's my comment.
Well,
Any
Mr.
response,
Chairman,
Mr. Moline?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator French, whatever term you use is going to become a term of art. If you are going through for an example, my family's rangeland, the fair market value of rangeland is different than fair market value of irrigated cropland. And so I agree that you've taken away a lot of alternative uses. So if, for an example, you have an area that's very scenic, it could be sold for development. Well, now with a pipeline on it, you can't get that. So the fair market value should not be of the rangeland. It should be the fair market value of what you could sell it for. The highest value possible that you could sell it for. So if you could sell it for $50,000 an acre for development, that's a lot different than fair market value of even irrigated farm ground. So that is an issue that will have to be better defined, because fair market value is just a term, and then you have to define the definition of it. So I think having a little bit more oomph in the law will help facilitate that bargaining position of the landowner.
Any additional questions for Mr. Moline from the committee? All right. I think that's it for Ms. Moline. Any additional public comment, either online or in the room? Ms. Bud Fallon, any closing comments for the committee?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I've got any closing comments except to offer my help in any review or drafting of additional bills. I'm happy to help the Minerals Committee look at the Utah law and figure out how to apply that in Wyoming, hoping that it would be broader than just dealing with the minerals issue and that it could also apply to these other eminent domain issues for, say, electric lines or whatever. In answer to the question about the quote fair market value, the Wyoming Constitution only deals with the issue of eminent domain. It doesn't say what fair market value is. The courts have taken on fair market value and defined it over 100 years of legislation as, quote, the value of the land at the time of the taking. So I suppose that the Wyoming legislature could change that. I would also suggest, though, that if we start defining it as 2 times or 3 times or try to put a monetary value on it, you're going to have a hard time because obviously land up next to Jackson is going to have a different fair market value than it is on the Red Desert. And so fair market value and appraisals have been a way that we have done it for years and years, because that sort of sets a standard that everybody follows in using an appraised fair market value. The one issue I would bring up with that is that the way they do fair market value is they look at the value of the land, not the value of the land with the improvement. So if you're going to put a collector line on it, and the highest and best use of that land is for, say, range cattle, the fair market value is based on range cattle, not on the fact that you now have an industrial use crossing your property. That was why it was so important to look at the Barlow case and litigate the Barlow case, because in the Barlow case, instead of just being paid for range value, which is what the property had been used for before, the Wyoming courts recognized that because there are other easements on the property and the property was now an industrial use because of the number of pipelines beneath the property, that could be calculated into the value, into the quote fair market value. That's why groups like Wyoming Stock Growers and the Farm Bureau and all of us are fighting so hard to make sure that Wyoming Supreme Court case is included in all of these bills, so that it actually does change it from regular fair market value from, say, range cattle or a hay meadow. If you've got other improvements on it, you get to count those improvements in the fair market value, and it does substantially increase the quote fair market value from the property.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Karen. So on this issue of the fair market value, one of the things that we use now routinely with particularly conservation easements is an appraisal, and the appraisal methodologies are out there to look at the highest and best value of that property, in addition to what the current value is associated with that agricultural production. And so I'm just wondering if there's some way we can weave in this concept of highest and best value of that property instead of just the current appraisal methodology that looks at the current use of that land, not the highest and best value use of that land. Any thoughts on that?
Ms. Bud Fallon.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. I think we'd have to be careful at the way that we do it. Because having everybody and their brother litigating over fair market value is also probably not a good use of people's time. With the conservation easement, those are fully voluntary. Nobody can force you to have a conservation easement on your property. And so the value of those, I think, are a lot easier to negotiate, even though they're fair market value, because you can say no to a conservation easement if you don't want to sell a conservation easement. When you're talking about like these, eminent domain issues where you're talking about a transmission line or a pipeline or somebody that can get eminent domain, then I think you're going to end up with a lot more litigation over what is the highest and best use of the property if you don't very carefully spell that out. And while the legislature may be totally well-intended, and I should be supportive of more litigation for attorneys, I think we've just got to be careful in that balance so that you don't end up with creating a litigation nightmare for people. So I'm not opposed to trying to redefine the issue. I just want to be careful and not end up with lawyer heaven litigation on what is the highest and best use or.
Senator Colton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bud Fallon, question, and I guess I'm asking you because I think you probably have the expertise. Does this have any direct impact on the evaluation of said property for property taxes? Do they go from ag usage to industrial usage because they now claim that, like in the case with the Barlow decision, did that change at all how that land was assessed for property taxes? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Bud Fallon.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, I can't answer that question. We talk about the property going, being used for a industrial purpose when you have a transmission line or whatever, but I have not ever been aware of that increasing anybody's property taxes, and I've certainly never heard that complaint. I haven't studied the property tax laws in the state of Wyoming, but no one has ever said that to me. And I honestly think if that were the case, somebody would have complained.
All right. Any additional questions? Seeing none, we're going to close public comment on this topic. Thank you, Ms. Bud Fallon, for being here and helping us out. Committee, what is your pleasure on this topic/issue?
Mr. Chairman, before we vote, I've got one question on the component looking at the 85% of the owners of the land. So and it's the mechanics. I'm trying to understand how that would actually work. So what happens if you have 3 landowners and 2 agree and 1 doesn't, and you only have 66% of the landowners and you don't meet that threshold of that 85%? What happens if you have 4 landowners and you have 3 that agree and 1 doesn't, and you're only at 75%? So I'm just trying to understand, is that what we're intended to do, or is it a majority? But when you set that percentage on there, there's a whole bunch of cases where it may be, even 5 landowners and 1 objects is only 80% of the landowners, and so the percentage to me is problematic, but maybe somebody can explain to me how that would work in those scenarios, or is it just this law is not applicable in those scenarios? Is that what we're intending to accomplish here, or is it really some type of majority of those landowners that are potentially facing condemnation? Question.
Well, just to chime in a little bit, because when we were talking about this last year, there's actually 2 provisions. One is 85% of the landowners. The other provision is 85% of the land. Now, I mean, if we assume let's just take your example where there's 5, and if they all own the exact same acreage, which is not likely, but possible, then I suppose then you wouldn't be able to condemn under the statute, even if you got the permission of 4 of them. If those four own more than 85% of the land, which is probably, could be likely or could not be likely. The one person might own more than all the other four put together. And so then they could hold up the eminent domain proceedings just by being the largest landowner too. So I don't know I think it's a good point, but I don't know the answer to that. But something we could work over think about and address over our next couple meetings if we decide to move forward with the bill draft.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of hypotheticals, but the converse is true. If you say 85% of the land, you may have 20 landowners. And my concern is they may actually start to route these systems so they can meet that litmus test of saying 85% of the land and then take the property rights out of the other 19 landowners. And so it's just not a clear-cut case of how this would apply in the real world. And I think we need to give that some thought before, as we move forward, if there is some other language that may be used versus those hard and fast percentages. Anyway, just some of my concerns, because you really are taking somebody else's property right based on a majority ownership. It's a concern I have with the legislature all along. This is to what rights do these folks have just because your neighbor has 85% of the land? Anyway, maybe we can give that some thought.
I think it's a good discussion. It's a difficult balance we got to strike there, because you also, the converse, the reverse of the argument is true as well. One person who owns 5 acres in theory could hold up tens of thousands of acres of ownership as well. So we got to, that's our job to find that balance that works for the legislation moving forward. And it's not going to be easy. That's for sure. Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think some of the intent behind this was to try to get them to negotiate with people more in a group setting rather than individually, and make sure that we are taking everyone into account rather than getting easements in and then a few people are left out and they feel the pressure. And so I think you bring up some valid points, and I look forward to having the discussion how we meet both of those needs.
All right, back to the question. What's the pleasure of the committee? Representative Slagle.
I would move, I guess it's Senate File 10.
Seconded by Representative Banks. Discussion. Representative Slagle.
Well, I think as we've looked at this, and as Mrs. Bud Fallon has pointed out, we have some work we need to do on it. I think we need to look at adding in the borrow language in section C on page 4. And I don't know how. I haven't had time to look at that, to do that. It might be we need to ask LSO to do that for us or something possibly.
Yeah, we can ask for some conceptual language in that regard.
The other thing I would say is possibly at the same time, they might add in some of that language of, well, I don't know if we want to do it on this one, because Minerals is doing the Utah language. But we might do the language, the notice to commissioners, and we need to discuss that as well.
Okay. Anna, could you also come up with some conceptual language regarding notice?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll try to figure out how to best do that, and I'll probably just give you some options in the staff comment or something like that.
That would be great. Thank you. And then the only other thing, would you check on the citation on page 2, the 818 versus 704 on line 5?
So, Mr. Chairman, that that references the new 818 in this bill draft. I think what might be best is to mention both 704 and 818 so that it's clear.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That would be great. Senator Kolb.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this 85% that they've come up with is a bit problematic. I mean, I think we need to do a little more research just to see if that's a justifiable number in balance. So we'd have more data to look at on how to judge that percentage with the LSO research possibly, Mr. Chair.
And just so I'm clear, Senator Kolb, you would like them to look at, for example, try to figure out on other projects, where eminent domain has been used, what percentage agreed and what didn't, or what are your thoughts exactly? I'm just trying to figure out what you want them to look into.
Well, I'm concerned about someone gaming the system, gaming it and designing, I mean, we're going to have some of that anyway, but I'm concerned about, is it fair to say 85%? Is 85% a fair number? That's, I guess, where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I just don't know if there's going to be any research for them that they can do. Anna?
Mr. Chairman, last year I tried to look into eminent domain situations with county commissioners and what have you, and there just isn't a whole lot of data out there to be like readily available for us to look at. But maybe I could speak to Miss Bud Fallon and see if maybe she has any ideas too. So.
Well, anything you could do for our next meeting would be helpful. And if that's not a lot, that's okay too. Whatever you could do would be great.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, on this same issue, what I'd like to know is what's a standard width of an easement for a collector system, particularly when we talk about 85% of the land? If I define across you that my easement's 100-foot wide, and then I get to your neighbor and it's I only need a 50-foot wide, that's part of the gamesmanship. And so if we could find, maybe PSC has something as what is a normal width of an easement, if there is any standards out there as to what that looks like. I think just its edification that helps me understand how much land are we actually talking about here, and what can they do? Is it up to the proponent? Is there a standard for the width of these easements? That gets back to the 85% of the land ownership. And so I'd like to see if we can find that out before the September meeting on.
Representative Banks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure exactly how to go forward with this, but I don't think we should keep the issue of liability out of our discussions completely. I think we definitely should be in contact with the Minerals Committee and the bill that they're putting forward. But I think we should still keep it on our radar of how we can apply it, because it might not apply to this specific discussion we're having here. So I think we should continue to have it in our discussions of how we can apply it directly to the transmission lines and things like that. And see, maybe we can combine it with the bill that's already going forward in the Minerals Committee. But I think it's still something we should keep on our radar.
Well, we do have several members of this committee that serve on both of those committees, and maybe that you all could brief us at the next meeting and tell us where we are and what's going on and whether we need to address that further. I mean, my concern with that particular very discrete issue is it would apply to a lot more utility lines than just the ones we're dealing with here. And if we're going to do that, we need to do it globally and broadly, not just here. And so I guess, why don't you all tell us at the next meeting, put that on your checklist, and we'll hear from you guys at the next meeting. All right. Any other discussion on the motion? All right. All in favor of a bill draft being prepared for our next meeting with the request we've made to Anna, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. All right, that motion has passed. All right, we are way ahead of schedule, almost an hour. And so I think we're going to keep rolling. with our agenda. We're going to move into Representative Alaman.
I just have I don't know if it's appropriate but a request to you. Can we have LSO draft up a bill like this concerning the CO2 lines? Because they are coming and they're going to be the very same problem this is. And I was hoping we could get them drawn up, a draft bill so that we can look at that in Buffalo. And I just didn't know if that's appropriate or not.
Well, I don't know if it's inappropriate. I think you can make that motion if you'd like. I will say it wasn't on our interim topic list. And so there really isn't a whole lot of notice to the public. So I'd prefer, if we're going to do that, that we put it on our agenda to talk about it the next meeting. You could then have a bill draft after that. But at least you could if we're going to do that, the chairman can decide whether they want it. When Chairman Eklund's back, he and Chairman Steinmetz can decide if they want to do that. You could request to them to put it on the agenda, but then we'd have a little more public notice for everybody to be there to talk about.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right. At this point, I'm also going to turn the meeting over to Senator French, who's going to chair for the remainder of the day. And we're going to start with the EID for livestock discussion. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The electronic identification for livestock, we have a memorandum from LSO. If Clayton would please run us through that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Clayton Caldwell, Legislative Service Office. I have produced for the committee a memo describing a recent rule amendment made by the U.S. Department of Agriculture regarding the use of electronic identification of cattle traveling interstate. What I can do for us today is briefly summarize the contents of this memo, and then I would be happy to stand for any questions. So just to get started, the USDA has the authority to issue orders and regulations on interstate animal identification and has used cattle and bison ear tag rules since 2013. The May 2024 rule amendment changes livestock or cattle and bison ear tag rules so that the ear tags, which are currently under those regulations, must be both visually and electronically readable instead of just visually readable. Now, the Wyoming Livestock Board import rules currently incorporate the USDA interstate transportation rules, and they establish additional requirements on cattle entering the state. Speaking on the utility of electronic identification systems, electronic systems have been shown to significantly decrease animal disease tracing time. For example, a tuberculosis trace in 2015 utilizing electronic identification took about 12 minutes, whereas a tuberculosis trace using non-electronic methods 2 years later took about 6 months. Now, some of the benefits of using electronic identification include reducing producer impacts from disease events, time and labor savings, improved safety during livestock handling, and improved domestic and international market access. A 2020 study was done to estimate the cost of implementing a national electronic identification system, and it estimated those costs based on whether or not a government cost-sharing program was being used, and it also attempted to estimate those costs at different parts of the supply chain. And finally, it attempted to estimate the necessary increase in demand, which would be required to pay for the cost of that program. And all of those cost estimates are provided on page 6 and the last paragraph of that memo. But just to briefly summarize one of the points made in that study, the study concludes that foreign and domestic demand have both fluctuated over time in degrees which are greater than the costs of such a program, and that increasing market access through that program could completely offset the U.S. beef producer costs, which would be incurred by a national EID program. That's a brief summary of the contents of this memo. I would be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Clayton. Committee, is there any questions for Clayton? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. Thank you, Clayton, for that. Next up is Steve True, Director of Wyoming Livestock Board.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee. Steve True, Director at the Wyoming Livestock Board. I believe you have two more online this morning. So I would just, for your pleasure, answer whatever questions you have of me regarding the ADT rule. And then you'll have the experts, you'll have our state veterinarian and Dr. Turner from the USDA ADT team online.
Any questions of Mr. True? Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Steve. I was just wondering who will enforce this? Who's responsible to enforce this new rule?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, this is a federal rule. So it'll be federally enforced. We control intrastate movement and enforce that. We also would be on the receiving end of if cattle came in that didn't meet that requirement or ours, that we would be in charge of that. I'm sure Dr. Hazel will want to touch on it, but I would make one comment where we differ. That LSO referred to, that is generally on cattle coming into the designated surveillance area. That's where the 12-month rule comes in rather than the 18-month, which is the federal rule. And just a quick notice, the classes of cattle under federal interstate rule haven't changed that are being required to be ID'd since 2013. It's just the tagging has changed in this rule. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an interstate rule. So if Wyoming cattle leave without it, then they're probably subject to regulation on the receiving end.
Follow up?
Yes.
All right, so then we're enforcing it on cattle coming in. Is that correct?
We enforce our import rules, which are to measure it with the USDA rule, except for cattle coming into the designated surveillance area, in which we're a little more critical. That rule changed in 2018. Originally, our import rules were at the same 18-month level. 2018, the board reviewed and discussed and reduced that to 12 months.
Okay, follow up.
Yes.
So how does that exactly work? So our brand inspectors then will be required on cattle coming in that we're importing to make sure that they have the EID tag. How exactly does this work?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, no, our brand inspectors won't enforce. They have not a compulsory, but they check now for OCV tags, official calf hood vaccinate tags on cattle that we're exporting, but that's just a visual that then might elicit some questions, but our brand inspectors do not enforce animal health rule. They only are the third-party neutral identifiers of the ownership of cattle, and then regulating movement through the brand inspections required to move said cattle wherever they're going.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'll ask the USDA.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Committee, any further questions of Mr. True at this point? Seeing none, we'll go to next is Dr. Hazel, the state veterinarian. It will be online.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
we can.
thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Sorry, I'm in a dark hole. I tried to find the least noisy spot that I could find, but it's a dark hole now. That being said, just a couple things to add before Dr. Turner proceeds with his testimony. Official ID has been required for cattle movement for many, many years. Official ID requirements for movement are not new on a certificate of veterinary inspection. The only thing really changing is the requirement that they be read electronically and not just visually. So official ID, as mentioned, has been required for many, many years for interstate movement. Now, the Wyoming Livestock Board has distributed probably close to 1 million EID tags over the last 5 to 7 years. So our producers are familiar with them, especially those within the DSA of Wyoming. And for veterinarians, they're used to having to write official ID or attach official ID in a spreadsheet or something like that. It's been a requirement for a certificate of veterinary inspection, as I said, for many years. So the only thing that they really realize that is changing is that it has to be a tag that can be electronically read as well. I think that's really all I have to add until Dr. Turner, until after he speaks. Is there any questions I may answer for the committee?
Thank you, Dr. Hazel. Committee, any questions for the doctor, Dr. Hazel? Seeing none, we'll go on to Mr. Turner. Was he on? Dr. Turner, can you hear us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
And with apologies for not being able to join you guys in person today in Rock Springs, certainly missed the opportunity. But my name is Dr. Alex Turner. I'm the Assistant Director at the National Animal Disease Traceability and Veterinary Accreditation Center with USDA APHIS in our Veterinary Services Unit. And so just wanted to add a little bit on to what's already been said ahead of me, and then I can also weigh in on the question that I believe Senator Steinmetz had. If she wants to re-ask for the record, that's fine as well. The rule was posted in the Federal Register. The proposed rule changes were posted back in January of 2023 and was open for comment for 120 days. And we did receive comments from multiple different stakeholder groups from around the country, including those in Wyoming, and read all 2006 comments that we had and formulated a reply in a final version of the rule based on those comments that was posted to the Federal Register on May 9th after being announced a couple of weeks prior to that in April in a press release. The reason for the press release followed by the Federal Register notice was that the rule was ready to be posted in the Federal Register at that April timeframe, but the Federal Office of the Federal Register was backed up by about that 2 to 3 weeks before it could be posted. So the rule was posted on May 9th, and that meant that 180 days after the rule was posted to the Federal Register, roughly 6 months, it would go into effect as a final rule, which would be November 5th of 2024, this coming fall. So that rule, as was mentioned before by Dr. Hazel and Mr. True, was to change what is the accepted official ear tag for cattle and bison to move interstate, not to move within the state necessarily, but what constitute a form of official ID. Of note is that the rule does not do away with previously existing forms of official ID that are allowed to be used in cattle and bison. Those include a group lot ID, tattoos, or brands where it's acceptable by both the shipping and receiving state. So if those methods of official identification are being used currently under the 2013 original rule, they can still be used when the new rule goes into effect. Additionally, I will say one other point is any animals that are tagged with a traditional visual only identification, like a metal noose numbered tag or a visual only panel tag that's official identification today, will carry over, and that will be considered official identification for the production lifetime of that animal for any requirements where it would need official identification. What that means is that animals aren't going to need to be re-tagged if they still retain their official ID that's applied before that November 5th, 2024 timeframe. So with that, I'll go ahead and respectfully, with the time of the committee, open it up to any questions. I'm happy to start with Senator Steinmetz's question to open as far as the enforcement question. I think that's a great question, and in the example that you gave where cattle arrive in Wyoming and they aren't compliant with Wyoming's entry requirements, while that would be a violation of some of the state regulations in Wyoming, that would also be an interstate violation if they arrive from out of state. And so there is also an enforcement opportunity there for USDA. And I will say USDA does do enforcement of those interstate movements. The converse situation where a shipment left Wyoming and was not compliant and arrived at another state of destination would be something that both the state of destination as well as USDA can look into with enforcement. And USDA handles enforcement through our Investigative Enforcement Services branch, which does investigate any of those reported violations. Sometimes those violations are the producer, sometimes they're the hauler, sometimes it's a market, sometimes it's an accredited veterinarian that has written the interstate certificate of veterinary inspection. But those investigations have a variety of outcomes based on the severity of the infraction. Happy to answer any additional questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Further questions? Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, thank you for answering that. So just, are you saying that visual identification is still adequate, that not every new tag, it would be after your rule takes effect? So basically the ones that are identified now, they live out their lifetime under their form of identification as right now. Are you saying all the new livestock have to have the EID tag, or are the old forms of identification adequate?
So to clarify the question a little bit, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz, the visual only tags that are currently acceptable as official ID, if they're placed before November 5th, when the new rule goes into effect, they will be good for the lifetime of that animal. After November 5th, those forms of official ear tags will no longer be acceptable. So an electronically and visually readable official ID tag, like today an RFID tag, would be required to meet that requirement. I hope that answers your question. Happy to take any clarifications that may have created.
Follow up?
Yes.
So then what if there is an agreement between states that they'll continue to utilize the previous forms of identification?
I don't believe that the traceability rule does allow for those types of agreements between shipping and receiving states, and whether that's a specific one-time movement or a regularly recurring type of movement. For the classes of cattle that require official ID to cross state lines, the states have that option to enter into an agreement like that. For most states, that would be most states that I'm aware of, and certainly, with neighboring states and the way business and markets work for you guys there in Wyoming, an agreement like that could be that, hey, this state accepts animals that are identified in such a manner from the state of Wyoming. Having said that, those animals might not necessarily qualify as being officially identified if that ear tag that's being used is no longer electronically readable and it was applied after November 5th of 2024.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Committee, is there further questions for Dr. Turner? Yes, Representative Element.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If a load of calves left Nebraska, their home of origin, and came to Wyoming in April, then in November were fed out here as yearlings, and then in November go back to Nebraska to their origin, will tags be needed in that case?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman and Senator. And I apologize, I didn't get your name on there. But for the Senator, the question in that case, I think there's two situations where those calves would not require official ID tags. The first one being if they're beef animals under 18 months of age, there's no requirement currently for interstate movements for those animals to require official identification of any kind. The current rule affects all dairy cattle of any age, all exhibition or show cattle, and I think that includes rodeo and fair cattle as well. But for beef animals under 18 months of age, they are not required to have official identification. There's a second scenario where they also might not require official identification, was if they were just coming over for a grazing permit. Those grazing permit movements also can happen and might not require official identification, especially if they're returning to the ranch of origin back in Nebraska at the end of the season.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. My apologies. The person that asked the question was Representative Allemand. So thank you. Further, Representative Banks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit in the last answer, but I just want to be clear. We live right on the border of Montana. I mean, and sometimes we don't even know where the border is there. So when I summer them in Montana and I have my grazing permit there and all the things that follow that, in order for me to go there from now on, after November, my new animals, am I going to have to get these electronic IDs, or because I'm just going there for a grazing permit and coming back, am I covered under the existing identification rules?
Dr. Turner?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Banks. That's a great question, and plenty of producers exist throughout the West, right on the state line, or where the state line goes down the driveway even. Those type of movements, those type of production movements, in most cases are covered by a grazing, not just the grazing permit, but a grazing permit and a grazing movement agreement between states. And so in those cases, those animals might not require official identification for the animals that are age eligible that would require it. Presuming that all of the animals that you're sending over to feed are not just calves, if they are calves and adult breeding age cattle that you're sending over there, then some of those animals could qualify for the traceability rule, being over 18 months of age and requiring official ID. However, grazing permits and grazing agreements between states don't always require official ID for those movements to happen, especially when it's within those normal production cycles. Ownership hasn't changed, and they're returning back to the premises of origin for processing in the fall.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Any follow-up? First we'll go to Senator Iden, then we'll go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You briefly mentioned rodeo livestock. Is there any special detail that we need to know about rodeo livestock regarding this? Thank you.
No,
Dr.
my apologies, Mr. Chairman and Senator Ida. There's not any specifics that have changed with rodeo or recreation or show or exhibition livestock and cattle and bison. That class of animal has always required official identification for interstate movements. And so the change for them will be that the official identification, if they're using ear tags, the official identification ear tags that would be acceptable. If they're applied after November 5th, those would be required to be electronically readable as well as visually readable. So like an RFID ear tag. For animals, and we know that not necessarily the roping and the roping and steer wrestling type of stuff, but some of the rodeo livestock might be of an age where they could be wearing a metal official ID tag today, and they might have a career of multiple years. So that ID tag is going to be good for the entire career of that animal that it stays in. New identification that's applied after November 5th would have to be electronically readable. Of note, we didn't get negative comments from PRCA and some of the other national events on our comments that we received. We do not make the assumption that no comment was a supportive comment at all. It's just we did not receive a comment that they had a specific problem with this for rough stock and rodeo stock. And keep in mind, that's for the ones that are moving interstate. I recently had a question about a cutting horse event where the cattle were coming, the beef calves were coming in of the age for the cutting event, but it was an in-state movement. The animals were beef animals. It was a local cutting event. So the traceability rule didn't apply to those specific animals because the animals hadn't met the age requirement or the interstate travel requirement for that time. They were being moved for a short time, used for the cutting event, and then going back to be fed out for the rest of their production cycle.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Follow-up, Senator Ide? Okay, Director True?
Mr. Chairman, I think Dr. Turner went where I was going to go with that, so I'll leave it sit there.
All right, thank you. Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Dr.
Turner. On the handout here, USDA APHIS animal traceability, it says species covered by this regulation on page 1 down at the bottom. It mentions others, sheep, goats, swine, horses, and other equids and captive cervids, deer and elk and poultry. So all of those need an identification?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies for jumping the gun to answer the questions. Senator Larson, so to answer your question, no, not all of the current rule sets forth, it does cover all of those species of livestock, and it sets forth what is required for official identification and for documentation for those classes of livestock to participate in an interstate movement. So to that end, our proposed rule change that goes into effect on November 5th is only for cattle and bison ear tags and not for any of the other livestock species for their forms of official ID.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Any follow-up? Nope. Any other questions from the committee for Dr. Turner at this point? Seeing none, we'll just kind of go back just for a second. Any questions for Director True, Dr. Hazel, or Dr. Turner? The three. Anything anybody think of? All right. So it looks like we're good. Looks like we have Brett Moline. Well, that'd be public comment, wouldn't it? With that, I guess we'll go to public comment. Anybody in the room here want to comment? Mr. Magagna?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon, Wyoming Stockholders Association. By way of background, I might mention that we've been very involved in the discussions and development of this rule over the past couple of years, both through our national organization as well as an organization. Our past president here in Wyoming served on a traceability task force that met many times over the past year, worked with USDA on the development of the rule and certainly expressed the concerns that we had as it moved forward. I provided all of you today with a handout. It actually was prepared by a sister organization, the Nebraska Cattlemen, but felt it provided such a helpful, simplified explanation and answer to many of the questions that are posed that with their approval, we actually distributed this to our membership at our convention last week to help them to better understand some of the mechanics of how this would work, because there has been a lot of misunderstanding. As just one example, I've had several calls from producers who understood that only a state veterinarian or only a veterinarian could install these tags, and that's clearly not the case. Any producer can install them. Another simple point that's been confusing is that you're required a producer not only purchase tags but purchase a reader. That's not a requirement. The tags, yes, and if the producer sees value in having a reader to use with those animals, certainly, but there's no obligation that they have a reader to read the tags. It's only that they install the tags. So those are just a couple of those examples. Are there some costs? Certainly there are. Those tags are more expensive than the other tags. It's been mentioned how they will be distributed. Just this past spring, Congress appropriated to USDA $15 million to be used to assist producers in the cost of acquiring these tags. So that will help for a period of time, obviously long-term, because new animals every year, those costs will still be there, or there will have to be an effort to seek additional funding for that purpose. Our concern as we looked at this rule has been to assure, number one, that we minimize the cost to producers. Number two, that we assure that as far as USDA is concerned, this data is only utilized for the purpose for which it's being gathered, and that is to assure traceability in the case of an animal disease outbreak. And some of the earlier versions of this we were very concerned with. We're generally comfortable with the version that's now become final, that those protections are provided. That does not preclude the person who installs these tags using them for other purposes. And that's the other thing that a lot of our producers today, even here in Wyoming, are using electronic ID tags for very different reasons, because they're participating in some of the programs that provide additional value to their cattle if they can be traced through the processing process. As we look in Wyoming to try to find ways that we can market a Wyoming beef product, both nationally and globally, and given that we don't have major processing facilities in the state, at some point, this type of traceability could be a tool in enabling us to trace that product through to be able to say, wherever we're marketing it, that this is truly what animals that were born, raised in Wyoming, even though they had to be processed elsewhere. So we see some value in it from that perspective. So cost was one concern. We feel that one is being, at least at this point in time, addressed. Confidentiality was a concern, and we feel that the rules that stands now addresses that. So generally speaking, at this point, based on policies that we've passed, we're supportive of working to go forward with the rule as it stands. Now, any future expansions of the rule, if should those come, will be a whole nother matter that will need to be addressed at that point in time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McGagnon. Committee, questions? Well, Senator Kolb first and then Mr. Senator Iden.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. McGagnon, what is the cost for the ID tags? I mean, what if the government, we didn't rely on, government, I'll sound like someone else a second here, printing money. What's the cost, the real cost, if you had to buy these tags? Do you have an idea that you could share with me and the committee? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I don't have the exact numbers on it, but some of the information I've seen, I believe they can range from $3.50 to $5 range right in there. But I could certainly stand to be corrected on that. I believe that's what I've seen.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are they reusable? Does anyone know? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, they're not reusable, no.
Thank you. Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kolb kind of picked up my first question. And this memo at least says there's no cost to the producer, but somebody has to pay for it. So that is a great question on what those numbers look like. My question is, when you say that the stock growers is supportive of the way it's written now without, going deeper into further legislation on this, how do you gauge that support? Did you put a poll out with your members and get feedback there? Could you tell us how you came to the supportive conclusion? Thank you.
Mr.
Mr.
McGagnon.
Chairman, Senator, I certainly, no, we didn't do a poll of our members, and I would certainly acknowledge that we have some of our members who are not supportive of this, who are not in favor of this. What I'm saying when I say we're generally supportive is that we adopted policy at our convention that addresses our criteria for what would need to be in a system to make it acceptable, and that the system that's now been proposed is generally in conformance with the policy that we established.
Okay. Thank you. Any follow-up? Okay. Representative Conrad.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. As it relates to the cost, I was curious as well. And on page 607 of the document that Clayton provided us, which is a clarifying question from him, it says the study estimated program cost ranges from $2.84 to $6.06 per head for cow-calf producers. My clarifying question is that with or without government cost sharing?
Mr. McGagnon, do you know?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I don't want to speak on behalf of the gentleman you had on here, but my understanding is that is what the cost would be if there was not government cost sharing.
Clayton?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that cost estimate is independent of whether or not a cost sharing program is used. To give an analogy, if something costs $20 to manufacture and the government pays for 15 and the producer pays 5, it still costs $20. The cost sharing is mentioned earlier in that paragraph.
Any follow-up? Okay, Senator, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So some of it, just to follow up on that question, some of it depends on whether you're enrolled in a program, if you have a relationship with some of these companies or entities that actually manufacture the EIDs. And so, for example, if you're enrolled in an all-natural or non-hormone treated cattle program, then the fees vary. And so you pay an enrollment fee for the calf because then they help you track the livestock through the slaughter process from birth till end. And so some of that, it just depends. And so all those vary, but that's going to be pretty close, that $3 to $4, somewhere in there, including the enrollment fee for your livestock, if you're involved in one of these other programs, which doesn't include, it does include the tag, but you wouldn't have to enroll in one of those programs. So just think there's different price schedules out there depending on what your particular outfit or ranch is doing.
Thank you, Chairman Craigo. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Seeing none, I guess we'll go next to Brett Moline, Farm Bureau. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. Question I have, given that animals will be individually ID'd, so when they go through the sale barn, for an example, a 200 cow outfit typically sells 15% of their cull cows, 15% of their herd every year in cull cows. So that's going to be about 30 cows. Who's going to pay the additional $30 a head that's going to cost for marketing if you go through a sale barn? Since added facilities will have to be built at the beginning and when the cattle come in and when the cattle go out, to be able to individually ID those animals electronically. Is that just going to be another cost that the producer is going to have to eat, or is the federal government going to help us out on that? That information came from a sale barn owner up in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So is that just going to be a cost that the producers are going to have to eat, or is the government going to have a program to build facilities and provide labor to the sale barns to facilitate this mandatory program? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director True, Dr. Hazel, or Dr. Turner, can you, any of you have an answer for that comment from Farm Bureau?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take first crack at it, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. So Mr. Moline, yes. I think that's a great question. And I think a couple of things with your example, if those were cull animals, one additional exception for official ID rules are the requirements for official ID don't apply to cattle that are moving direct to slaughter or that are moving direct to one approved livestock market and then direct to slaughter. So I suspect we're thinking of the same market in the Black Hills. And if they were to go to that market and then to slaughter to be marketed, those cattle, even though they are of an age that normally would require official ID as cull animals, they would not require official ID to go directly to that approved livestock market and then to go direct to slaughter, even if they're being processed in another state outside of the Black Hills. So hopefully that answers that aspect of the official identification. And then I guess I would just add to that, that if the official individual IDs are not being currently collected for documentation or for movement purposes out of that same market or any market in or out of the state of Wyoming, then going forward, that's a class of cattle that still doesn't require that official ID to be collected or potentially even to be in place for those animals. So there are some variables there, and that exception was meant intentionally for that producer who does market those 15 head a year that are cull animals, that those animals don't need to be tagged just for that last 2 weeks worth of marketing as they go eventually make it into slaughter. or even into feeding channels and then to slaughter. So the other thing is those animals, if they don't currently have an official identification, they can make that movement using a USDA supplied and approved back tag, which can be used for those animals that don't have official ID in lieu of official ID for those specific movements. Again, direct to an approved livestock market or direct to slaughter.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Mr. Moline, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. In other words, the added marketing costs, because a lot of those animals, those cull cows, and they come in, they're thin, they go to a feedlot, go out to pasture. So again, any added cost will be eaten by the producers, the answer I've heard.
Correct. So in that instance, if they go direct to the approved livestock market in the Black Hills area from Wyoming, any additional cost to get them up to, if they aren't going direct to slaughter out of that market, then they need to meet the requirements to leave the approved livestock market to go graze where they're going to graze, whether that's in state or out of state. And again, to use that example, if they're going to South Dakota and they're going to go to a third state to graze and put on weight prior to slaughter, those costs would still be the costs of the on the obligation of the producer. As far as the official identification that's required to meet that movement, again, they can move from the producer in Wyoming, can market them and take them direct to the market without official identification because that's an approved livestock market. And in most cases, those markets are approved tagging sites. And then if the animals move out of state for their next movement, it would be the buyer and the, potentially the seller who would incur those costs to make sure those animals meet the requirements of that we have in place for the ADT rule. That kind of goes back to the senator's question about compliance and who enforces the compliance, and to keep in mind that any given movement to meet the needs or to meet the requirements of the movement across state lines, that movement hasn't violated anything until it moves across state lines and is a covered class of livestock and a covered movement of that livestock across state lines. So at that point, all of the involved parties would have to cover that cost.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Any further comments, Mr. Moline?
I'm good. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay. Any questions? Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up on that, because I keep getting more confused. So where is the checkpoint? Who is responsible to find out if the cattle are tagged or not? So for example, in the example we just talked about, is it the sale barn that then are we putting, because that's additional requirements for the sale barn, which are obviously passed on to the producer or the buyer, either way, which they could be a producer too. But so where is the checkpoint? Is USDA going to deploy people to every sale barn to make sure these processes are being followed? And what about a private transaction where you've got a registered herd and they have a buyer every year and they sell, intact females or pairs or whatever they sell, or bulls? Who is policing that and how does that happen? I really don't understand. So if you could let me know, I'd appreciate it.
Dr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz. The compliance and enforcement parts of it, USDA does not have people deployed to every state crossing of livestock. And some states actually do have inspection stations at California is a recent example where I was just out last week at a meeting, and California has 13 inspection stations for state entries. As you can imagine, California has many more than 13 ways into California, so not every livestock conveyance gets stopped. But the way that the ADT rule currently reads is again, that violation, to go back to the example of a Wyoming producer sending something to the market in South Dakota, the market is obligated in South Dakota to make sure that those animals meet South Dakota's entry requirements, as well as are compliant with the animal disease traceability rule. And so while USDA doesn't necessarily have someone at every market on every sale day, an approved livestock market is required to have either one of the three following representatives there, either an accredited veterinarian, which can be a private veterinarian, who has federal accreditation with the National Veterinary Accreditation Program, or a state representative with the State Department of Agriculture or Livestock Board or whomever that may be, or a federal USDA APHIS representative who might be there. And so many states and the 1,300 approved livestock markets that we have in the country right now, on every sale day are required to have one of those three representatives there to provide services, to provide compliance, and to report compliance issues if and when they see them. For the most part, most of the markets, we don't have major compliance issues, and we don't have widespread reports of those issues being there, but we don't also have law enforcement officers there to receive and penalize producers if they show up. For us, certainly for USDA, yes, we see some violations which need to be addressed, but we also want to make sure that we have an appropriate time to educate producers and to educate livestock markets about the change in requirements. So today is the current rule that's been in place for 11 years. Those animals that require official ID to arrive at that market in South Dakota, they've required that for the last 11 years. And so the compliance reports that we get out of that stuff aren't widespread. We know that we can't catch every infraction that happens. And your example of a country sale that might be video, might be a contract sale or whatever, the same regulations apply, but there's not necessarily, again, a compliance officer. The producers in the country are not obligated to run that by Dr. Hazel's office for every transaction that happens in this state. We realize that the brand inspection divisions for the 14 Western states that have brand inspection divisions have some additional obligation for brand inspection laws, and that usually is considered to be property inspections and transactional inspections rather than the official animal ID inspections. I think, as Mr. True noted, I know at least in Colorado, our brand inspectors will make note if official ID exists and sometimes add that to an animal's brand inspection as part of what they do, but that's not the sole part of why they're there. And the brand inspectors are not considered to be enforcement in any of the states that I'm aware of, although I have heard in Washington, I believe the brands division does work pretty closely with their state veterinarian's office, that when the brands division sees some of those, they'll ask the question of the state veterinarian to say, is this a problem? This is what we're seeing, and so on and so forth. So that's how compliance has worked for the animal disease traceability rule for the previous existing 11 years, going back to 2013. That's how we anticipate it to work going forward with this change to electronic ID ear tags as official ID ear tags for cattle and bison. I hope that cleared things up and didn't muddy the waters anymore, but I'm, again, happy to make sure we get a clear answer for you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Any follow-up, Senator Stein? We'll go with Director True and then Senator Kolb.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, just to catch a little further on your private transaction or your country sale. In that case, if those animals are going out of state, they're getting a health inspection from their local veterinarian anyway, and it's his responsibility to make sure those cattle comply with whatever those import requirements are to that state on that, and then he'll match that with the brand inspection. And if it's it's not general, but if it's necessary, then that health inspection number will be noted on the brand inspection as well.
Thank you, Director True. Any follow-up, Senator? Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a general question. What thing happened that made this need necessary for these tags? What's going on here? What catastrophe happened? What's the history in the last year that this is going to somehow solve this? I mean, why is this going to solve the problem it's trying to solve? I mean, what's wrong here? Could someone tell me why we need well, why we need this. That's my general question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director True, you want to take a shot at this and then we'll go on to,
Mr. Chairman, I'll pass that one right along. Thank you.
all right, we'll go on. A good answer there.
We don't.
Yeah, we'll go to Dr. Turner. Do you
Yeah,
have
Mr. Chairman and Senator Kolb, I think great question. That's the history of this rule and where this dates back to is all the way back to 2003 with the bovine spongiform encephalopathy of the cow that stole Christmas. And just to frame it for those of you that aren't aware, that was the first detection of mad cow disease here in the US. And we had to prove to our trading partners that that cow actually was an animal that originated in Canada for that disease. So even though she'd been in Washington state for the previous months to years, we needed to prove that she originally was exposed to that disease in Canada before she came to the US. So she still was wearing Canadian official ID tags. But at the time, the time it took to prove that to our trading partners caused massive losses to our export market and really hurt the price of beef cattle across the country by that drop. So that was because it took us 4 days to prove that it was a Canadian cow through the record keeping and through the official identification she had, which at the time was not an electronically readable tag. It was a visual only tag from Canada. To compare and contrast that to something that did happen in the last year was last summer, we had another case of bovine spongiform encephalopathy here domestically in a beef cow from Tennessee. Periodically, we get what's called atypical BSE, which is a presentation of the disease that is to be expected in certain ages of cattle at a very low rate. So our current surveillance programs through the USDA and through slaughter surveillance programs do their job in trying to catch the instances of this that they should catch to make sure that our food supply is safe and that specific disease doesn't make it. That animal was wearing one of the RFID tags that was distributed via USDA to the state of Tennessee and that the state of Tennessee has distributed to some of their producers. So the producer was having a dispersal sale, sold the animal, and the animal ended up shortly thereafter being a cull animal at a slaughter plant in South Carolina. When South Carolina said we have a sample, we have a suspicious sample that we're going to submit to the lab, while that phone call was going on, they also had the ID tag number. And since that ID tag number was correlated with the Tennessee premises ID number through the distribution of the state of Tennessee, that tag was able to be traced to the market where that animal was sold for slaughter within 15 minutes. And within that same 15 minutes, they had placed a call to the livestock market, and the livestock market was able to say it's one of these 5 birth herds are the only 5 that we need to further investigate. What that did for the cattle industry in Tennessee and for the cattle industry in the southeastern US, that meant that we, the USDA and the state of Tennessee, did not need to quarantine the whole state. They did not need to quarantine any single market, and we did not need to do any response activities. So the rest of the market and the rest of the country could carry on their business and not be impacted by that. Further, because the testing revealed that it was an atypical case of BSE, we did not need to announce to our trading partners that we had a typical case of BSE, which would have caused trade impacts, but rather we could say by the time we made that announcement the next day with confirmed laboratory results, we could say we've traced this back to one of 5 birth herds and are doing the investigations that our trading partners require, as well as our food supply requires, to ensure that there's no other instances of animals that were showing signs of this disease in the food supply. So that protected Wyoming cattle by making sure that the markets for Wyoming cattle were not impacted by that announcement or that disease at all, because we were able to trace and respond to the disease so quickly. So that was where the need for this came from. And just that happens to be a recent example. Really, the disease, the foreign animal disease that definitely gives, I think, a lot of regulators heartburn would be foot-mouth disease virus, which currently doesn't exist in North America except at the Plum Island Animal Disease Center off the eastern coast of New York at our research center. And maybe in North America, I think the Canadian lab in Winnipeg also has some.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Dr. Hazel, do you have any further insight for this question?
Mr. Chair, thank you. No further comment. Dr. Turner pretty much explained the entire process and the reasoning behind this. Thank you.
All right, Senator Colby, follow up. Committee.
I have a follow-up. I wish all government worked that fast. Thank you.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, I won't belabor things here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The federal government doesn't really pay attention to costs on anything. Obviously, we're $35 trillion in debt. Does anybody have any numbers or do they, when they make rules like this, do we have any data on how many federal full-time employees it takes to police this now? Anybody have any comments on that or any information on that? Because, all we see is $3 per ear tag, but what's the rest of, what's under the hood there? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that question?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, I don't
Dr.
think I have. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Ide, I think that's a good question. And as far as the exact number to police or enforce things, I do not have that number. I don't know if that number is collected. We did do some cost analysis with our proposed rule that we submitted in January in the Federal Register, and again, addressed that in the final rule as well. The cost for enforcement for this particular change, we don't anticipate the cost of enforcement on the federal side and to change versus what the cost of enforcement has been since this rule went into place in 2013. But to go back to your original question, I have not necessarily seen nor tried to put together that exact number for how many dollars it costs to enforce the animal disease traceability rule in the program.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Dr. Hazel or Director True, any info on that?
Mr. Chair, this is Dr. Hazel. I just want to add that although the electronic requirement is new, the requirement for official ID is not new. That's something that's been going on, and Alex, maybe you have a date on that, but that's been required for a very, very, very long time for movement. And as far as enforcement of official ID in the past, Dr. Turner explained that, and Steve as well, that it just depends upon the destination state, where they're going to, who happens to see those cattle, whether or not it's reported by the receiver. There are various ways that might be reported that those rules were not met in the past. That doesn't really change with the addition of the electronic ID. So enforcement doesn't really change from what it already has been in the past many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hazel. Director True, anything? Okay, any follow-up? Any follow-up? Mr. Ide, Senator Ide. Okay, any further questions from the committee? Any further public comment? Well, I think we've pretty thoroughly talked to us this one through. So do we just go on to the next thing or? Okay, committee, do you want to work through lunch and get out of here early? Because a lot of people have a pretty long drive, or do you want to take an hour for lunch?
Mr. Chairman, before we go on to that, can I suggest something the committee do about this?
Sure.
I think that I've heard from people in my area, they're very concerned about this. And I think we can do something along the lines of maybe trying to establish MOUs with the surrounding states. And if it's the committee's pleasure, I think we should try and go about doing something like that and see if we can. I would be happy to contact some of the other states and get the ball rolling and see if we can make the process as it is now, not having to require these electronic IDs for simply crossing state lines with those that surround us. So if that's the committee's pleasure, I think we should pursue something of that nature.
Representative Banks, I think I'll turn that over to Chairman Steinmetz and Chairman Crago to see if that's something they want LSO and yourself and others to do for our next meeting in Buffalo. So.
Yes, Mr. Chairman French, I would agree with that. That was an idea we discussed at supper that I thought we might pursue. Also, I think that we need to make sure that the state and our producers are not bearing the cost of this. And I think that's another aspect that we need to look into, because as most of the people in this room know, our congressional representative has been fighting this tooth and nail. This is not something that we have willingly wanted to do. We ran a bill 2 or 3 years ago that was supposed to help with this, that said it was voluntary what form of ID our producers wanted to use here in the state of Wyoming. So there are many of us who don't have warm fuzzy feelings about this rule, and we have fought it tooth and nail all the way. We already have disease traceability that's been verified. It may be a little quicker in some instances, but there could be other problems arise with your system that we haven't discussed today. So with that, I would agree that we need to work on this some more and possibly draft some legislation to direct the Livestock Board to pursue MOUs with surrounding states. I believe they did some research for me to see where all our cattle are going so that we kind of know, and we appreciate that research. We kind of know where they're going, because this will disproportionately affect the state of Wyoming, where we export most of our cattle. And so that's another important thing to be aware of. Thank you.
Representative Banks, is that good for you? Okay. Committee, any other Senator Hicks?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss. I do have one correction to something that Dr. Turner said, specifically related to hoof and mouth disease and the location. I have witnessed several outbreaks of hoof and mouth disease in the Wyoming legislature over occasion. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. That could be, it kind of same as lab grown steak. So thank you for that. Any further comments? All right, the big question, do you want to continue on to the brucellosis update? It's 12:15, Anna. Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to be clear. Do you want me to draft the legislation directing the Livestock Board to work with other states?
Make a motion.
Representative Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we direct LSO to draft legislation for our next meeting that would direct the Livestock Board to establish or look into establishing MOUs with the surrounding states of the state of Wyoming.
And I'll second it.
Seconded by Representative Eminent. Yeah, motion by Representative Banks, second by Representative Eminent. So those in favor say aye. Discussion, sorry. Further discussion on it? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same. Okay, LSO, thank you for doing that. Thank you, representatives. Now back to the big question. Do you want to take a time out to go eat some lab grown meat or?
Yes, lunch.
Or continue on to the brucellosis update? That's our last item. I suspect that will take less than an hour. Chairman Crago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess there's something else that I believe we're gonna bring up that's not on the agenda, which will likely take some time. So just throwing that out there, if we're gonna talk about Representative Winter's letter, then I would suggest we go to lunch and come back and finish up, because otherwise it might get late and some of us might get hangry.
Lunch.
Okay, with that, it sounds like we're gonna go to lunch. It's 12:15, 1:15. Everybody good with that? An hour? Okay, let's try to be back at 1:15, please.